I am Margaret, a 67-year-old woman, and my story begins in a little stone cottage with ivy on the walls and a fire that always crackled in the hearth. That cottage was small by any measure, only 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that seemed to sigh when too many people stood in it. But to me it was the entire world. The walls held in not just warmth, but voices, laughter, secrets, and prayers. In winter, the wind would whistle through the cracks near the window frames, and I would sit close to the fire, wrapped in a shawl, watching the flames dance as though they carried stories from long before I was born. Even now, I can still hear the popping of the wood, the faint scent of smoke in my hair, and the comfort of knowing I belong to that place. My earliest memories are of my mother, humming hymns while kneading bread at the old wooden table. That table was scarred and dented, but it was the most important piece of furniture in the house. We ate our meals there, but it was more than that. It was where we prayed, where we sorted through troubles, and where we celebrated joys. When my father was in good health, he would bow his head and say, "Grace," his rough farmer's hands folded like those of a child before the Lord. When he fell ill, I remember neighbors knocking at our door with baskets of milk, bread, or sometimes a pot of stew. People had little themselves, but they always gave. It was in that cottage I first understood that community and kindness were more precious than gold. I had 2 sisters, older than me, though not by much. We shared one bed, huddled under a single blanket in the cold months. At night, before sleep claimed us, we whispered our dreams. My eldest sister wanted to be a teacher. The middle one dreamt of singing in faraway cities. And I, the quietest of the 3, simply wanted to be like my mother, steady, dependable, the sort of woman who held a family together. There were quarrels, of course, as sisters always have, but they were forgotten quickly. We didn't have many possessions, so sharing was not a choice but a way of life. Those early lessons in patience and compromise have carried me all these years. School was a humble affair. I carried my books tied with a piece of string, and the long walk on frosty mornings often left my toes numb. I was never clever with numbers, but I loved stories and scripture. Each verse I learned seemed to open a window, showing me a wider world beyond our village lanes. I remember sitting at my desk, ink staining my fingers, as I copied out passages that spoke of hope and perseverance. My teacher once told me I had a gift for remembering words, and though I never became a scholar, I cherished that gift. When I was 10, my grandmother passed me down her recipe book. The cover was worn and stained with years of flour and butter, and the pages were filled not only with instructions for pies and stews, but with little notes about when to serve them, and which occasions they best suited. "Food keeps families together," she told me. At the time, I didn't understand the depth of that truth, but as I grew older and gathered my children and later my grandchildren around the table, I came to see that meals are a language of love. That recipe book is one of my most treasured possessions. Our village was small, but life had its share of color and joy. Each spring brought the May Fair, and I can still feel the ribbons in my hair and the giddy thrill of dancing around the pole with my friends. There was laughter, music, and a sense that the whole village was one big family. I think it was there, beneath the fluttering banners and bright skies, that I first began to dream not just of surviving life, but of truly living it. My father's illness cast shadows over my childhood, yet it was in those dark days that I learned the meaning of resilience. My mother never once let despair rule her. She leaned on her faith and taught us to do the same. When cupboards were nearly empty, she would say, "Thank God for what we have today." And somehow her calm voice made the hunger less sharp. She reminded us that gratitude is not for when life is full, but especially when life is bare. At 16, I met James, a farmer's boy with steady hands and kind eyes. He wasn't rich, and he didn't try to impress me with grand words, but there was something in his manner that made me feel safe, as though the storms of life would be easier to bear with him by my side. We wrote letters when we couldn't meet, and those letters were filled with simple things. What the weather was like, how the crops were growing, what passages of scripture had comforted us that week. Looking back, I realized those letters were a foundation for a love built not on fleeting passion, but on faith and friendship. He proposed by the river one summer afternoon, his hands trembling as he held out a silver ring. It wasn't grand, but it was honest, and I needed nothing more. Our wedding was simple too. Wildflowers gathered from the fields, homemade pies baked by neighbors, and music played in the village hall. We didn't have money for extravagance, but we had love, and that was enough. The years that followed were not easy. Winters were harsh, and there were times when we patched holes in the roof with scraps of cloth and warmed ourselves with one fire. Yet through every difficulty there was joy. When my first child was born, I held her tiny hands and whispered prayers over her. I felt then, as I still feel now, that every child is a gift entrusted to us for a time, and our duty is to love them, guide them, and let them grow. Now, at 67, I look back at the little stone cottage with ivy on the walls, and I realize that though the building was small, the life it contained was vast. Every laugh, every tear, every prayer spoken there shaped the woman I became. My story began with a crackling fire in that hearth, and even though I live elsewhere now, the warmth of those flames has never left me. It still burns in my heart, reminding me that home is not made of stone or wood, but of faith, love, and the traditions we pass on. I still remember polishing my black shoes every Saturday night, ready for church. Respect and preparation were lessons sewn into me as a child, and though at the time it seemed like nothing more than a chore, it became one of those small rituals that shaped my character. The shoes themselves were nothing fine. They were plain, scuffed from years of wear. The leather cracked a little at the edges, and the soles worn thin from walking the long lane into the village. But they were mine, and they were for Sunday, and so I treated them with the greatest care. Every Saturday evening, after supper was cleared away and the table wiped down, my mother would set out the little tin of polish. She always said that our outward appearance was not about vanity but about honor. Honor to ourselves, to our family, and most of all to God. I would dip the rag into the polish, careful not to waste a drop, and work it into the leather with slow, steady circles. The smell of the polish filled the kitchen, sharp and earthy, mixing with the lingering aroma of whatever stew or bread had been made that day. My sisters sometimes complained, wishing they could be out playing instead of shining shoes, but I rather liked the quietness of it. It gave me time to think, to daydream, and sometimes to listen to my mother humming softly as she folded laundry by the fire. Those shoes were more than footwear. To me, they were a symbol of belonging. On Sunday mornings, when we walked the 1.5 miles into the village, I would step carefully to avoid puddles and mud, determined to keep the black shine intact until we reached the church doors. Along the way, we often passed neighbors, and there was always a sense of shared anticipation. Men wore their best jackets, women carried Bibles wrapped in cloth, and children tried their best to look neat. It was as though the entire village understood that Sunday was not an ordinary day, but a sacred pause in the week, a time to set aside toil and gather together in reverence. As a child, I did not fully grasp the weight of it all. I only knew that when the church bells began to ring, my heart quickened. There was something about the sound echoing across the fields that made even the smallest of us straighten our backs and quicken our steps. And when we entered the church, with its high wooden beams and the faint scent of old stone and candle wax, I would glance down at my polished shoes and feel proud. However poor we were, however worn our clothes might be, I knew that I had done my part to show respect. Preparation, my mother often told me, was a form of gratitude. You prepare because what you are about to do matters, she said. It wasn't just about shoes or clothes. It was about the heart. She insisted we lay out our Sunday garments the night before, so there would be no rushing or quarreling in the morning. She reminded us that walking into church with peace in our hearts was just as important as walking in with polished shoes. At the time, those words seemed lofty to my young ears, but now, decades later, I see how true they were. So much of life is in the preparation, of meals, of days, of choices, of hearts. The act of polishing shoes every Saturday grew into a rhythm I carried into adulthood. Even after I married James and set up our own small household, I continued the ritual. On Saturday evenings, I would gather my children around the hearth and hand them each a rag and a pair of shoes. They would groan at first, just as my sisters and I once did, but I insisted. I told them that it was not about shoes at all, but about learning respect, patience, and care for the little things. To this day, when I see one of my grown children polishing their own shoes or teaching their little ones to do the same, I feel a warmth in my chest, knowing the lesson has traveled further than I could have imagined. The memory of those shoes also reminds me of the importance of small details in our lives. It is easy to think that grand gestures and big accomplishments are what matter most, but often it is the simple, repeated habits that shape who we are. A polished shoe, a bowed head in prayer, a loaf of bread baked with care. These are the things that build character quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you look back and see that your entire life has been guided by them. I sometimes wonder what children today make of such things. Life moves faster now, and the rituals of preparation are often cast aside. Yet I believe that even in a hurried world, people still hunger for meaning in the small acts. To pause and polish, to take time to prepare, to honor an occasion by bringing your best. These things may seem old-fashioned, but they hold wisdom. They remind us that nothing sacred should ever be entered into carelessly. Looking back, I smile at the girl I was, bent over a pair of worn black shoes, determined to make them gleam as though they were brand new. I had no idea then that I was practicing more than a task. I was practicing discipline, reverence, and gratitude. I was learning that dignity is not about wealth or fine clothing, but about the effort you put into caring for what you have. Those shoes carried me into the church of my childhood, down the aisle on my wedding day, and later into the homes of friends and neighbors where I went to offer help. They carried me through ordinary days and extraordinary ones, always reminding me of the values stitched into me as a child. Now, at 67, when I sit by the fire and see my grandchildren tumble into the room with their bright sneakers and careless ways, I sometimes call them over and tell them the story of my black shoes. They laugh at the thought of polishing leather on a Saturday night. But I can see in their eyes a spark of curiosity, maybe even respect. And so I tell them again, hoping that one day when they are older, they will remember that their Nana believed in preparation and respect, and that even the smallest rituals can shape a lifetime. Our wooden table was the heart of our home. We prayed there, ate there, and sometimes even cried there. That table taught me that family matters more than anything. It was a large, rough-hewn piece, built by my grandfather's hands long before I was born. The wood was thick and scarred, its surface uneven, with little dents from knives and hot pans, and watermarks left from countless cups of tea. It wasn't polished or fancy, yet it was strong, steady, and welcoming, much like the people who sat around it. Every morning began with that table. My mother would set out bowls of porridge or slices of bread with jam, and my sisters and I would tumble onto the benches, hair still messy from sleep, rubbing our eyes. Father would already be there, sometimes with the day's newspaper, sometimes with nothing but silence and a steaming cup of tea. Before a bite passed anyone's lips, he would clear his throat, bow his head, and offer thanks for the food, even on days when there was very little to give thanks for. He spoke those words with sincerity. I didn't understand it then, but now I see that beginning each day with gratitude gave us strength for whatever might come. The table was also the place where my mother taught us to work. She rolled out pastry on its surface, sprinkled flour like snow, and shaped loaves of bread while we watched. When we were old enough, she set us to peeling potatoes, snapping beans, or shelling peas. Our little hands weren't quick or neat, but she never minded. "It isn't about speed," she would say. "It's about being part of the work that feeds us all." Those lessons weren't just about food. They were about responsibility, about each of us having a role in the well-being of the family. On Sundays, the table became a place of reverence. After church, we returned home and crowded around for the biggest meal of the week. There might be a roast if times were good, or a stew if they weren't. But either way, it felt like a feast. The table was set more carefully then, clean cloth, best dishes, and sometimes flowers picked from the hedgerow. Those Sunday meals weren't about the food so much as the togetherness. We lingered longer, talking and laughing, my father occasionally telling stories from his youth. My sisters and I drank it all in, feeling as though the table itself gathered our joy into its wood, keeping it safe for us. But the table also held our tears. I remember the day my father's illness grew worse, and the doctor came to sit with us. He laid his bag on that very table and spoke in a low, serious voice, while my mother sat pale and still, her hand clenched around the edge of the wood. My sisters cried openly, but I pressed my face to the table's surface, the grain of the wood rough against my cheek, trying to anchor myself in its steadiness. That table had borne meals, laughter, prayers. It could surely bear our sorrow too. And it did. It listened silently, holding our grief as faithfully as it held our bread. As we grew older, the table became the setting for countless lessons and conversations. It was where my mother taught me how to balance a household budget with only a few coins to stretch through the week. It was where my sisters and I studied our schoolwork, our books spread wide across the wood, the scratches from our pencils adding new marks to the already worn surface. It was where my father, when his health allowed, taught me the value of honesty. I once admitted at that table to breaking a neighbor's window while playing. I feared a beating, but instead, Father spoke calmly about responsibility and making amends. Then he walked me to the neighbor's house and helped me offer both apology and labor to pay it back. That lesson, delivered from across the table, has stayed with me all my life. When James began courting me, he came often to sit at that table. My mother, sharp-eyed and protective, would watch how he carried himself. James never slouched, never spoke rudely, and always bowed his head at grace. It was at that table that I saw his patience, his steadiness, his respect for my family. I knew then that he was the kind of man who would build a life with me, not just for me. Later, when he asked for my hand, my parents gave their blessing at that very table. Their fingers laced together as they looked at me with both pride and worry, knowing I was stepping into a new life. After I married and moved into my own home, I carried with me not the table itself, but the values it represented. Around my own smaller table, I raised my children in the same way I had been raised. Prayers before meals, work shared by many hands, conversations that shaped their character. And just as in my childhood, it became the place for both laughter and tears. I can still remember the night one of my sons confessed to a mistake that weighed heavily on him. He spoke the words with his head bowed, his fingers tracing the edge of the table, as if the wood itself could give him courage. I sat beside him, just as my mother once sat beside me, and told him that truth and repentance matter more than perfection. The table once again became not just a piece of furniture, but a witness to growth. Now, in my later years, when I visit my children and see their own tables, modern, polished, some of them bought new from shops rather than carved by hand, I feel a quiet joy. The wood may be different, the styles changed, but the heart of it remains the same. Families still gather, still bow their heads, still share meals and stories across the surface. A table, no matter its shape or polish, is the altar of a home. The old table from my childhood cottage still exists. My sister kept it after my parents passed, and though it is battered nearly beyond use, she refuses to part with it. When I visit her and see the familiar grooves and stains, I run my fingers across them and feel a rush of memory, of prayers whispered, bread broken, lessons learned, tears shed, laughter shared. That table taught me from my earliest days that family matters more than anything. It wasn't just where we ate. It was where we became who we were meant to be. I grew up with two sisters. We shared one bed, one blanket, and endless secrets whispered after dark. The bed was small, its iron frame squeaking each time one of us shifted, but to us it felt like a fortress, a little world of our own where no one else could intrude. We squeezed together, shoulders pressed, feet tangled, trying to keep warm in the long winters when the frost crept along the window panes. Some nights the cold bit so deep that we tucked the blanket tightly around us and pulled it right over our heads, turning the bed into a cave of whispers and giggles. Inside that cocoon, we shared everything, our hopes, our fears, the things we dared not say aloud in daylight. My eldest sister, Anne, was the most serious of the three of us. She was quick with her lessons at school, sharp with numbers, and always certain she was meant for something greater than the narrow lanes of our village. She would whisper about becoming a teacher, traveling to towns with proper schools and libraries, and standing in front of a classroom full of children who would look up to her. I believed her. She had that kind of determination. Even as a child, her words carried weight, and when she spoke of her future, it felt as though she was willing it into existence. The middle sister, Mary, was softer, more dreamy. She had a voice like birdsong, and she often whispered that one day she would sing in places far grander than our church choir. She used to hum us to sleep, her voice carrying the lilt of hymns and folk songs passed down through our family. Sometimes she would close her eyes and sing with such feeling that even Anne stopped correcting her. And I lay still, convinced that heaven itself had opened its ears to listen. Mary's dreams were fragile things, spun from hope and music, but they lit up our nights just the same. And then there was me, the youngest, listening intently to both of them. I didn't always have grand dreams to share. Instead, I spoke of the things I loved, the way the ivy curled around the cottage walls, the smell of bread baking, the sound of Father's voice when he read scripture. I often said that when I grew up, I wanted a home just like the one we had, filled with warmth and steadiness. Anne laughed at me sometimes, telling me my dreams were too small, but Mary would squeeze my hand in the dark and say, "There's nothing small about wanting love." Our whispered conversations stretched on for hours, long past the time Mother had told us to sleep. Sometimes she would push open the door, candlelight spilling in, and tell us sharply to hush. We would lie still, our eyes wide open until the door closed again, and then we would burst into stifled laughter, covering our mouths with the blanket. Those giggles, those secret rebellions, bound us together as tightly as the blanket we shared. Of course, sisters don't only share laughter and secrets, they share quarrels too. There were nights when Anne, determined to stretch her legs, hogged the blanket, and Mary yanked it back with a huff. I, trapped between them, often ended up cold and grumpy. Harsh words were exchanged, threats of moving to the floor or telling Mother, but no quarrel ever lasted long. The bed was too small for grudges, and warmth too precious to waste on pride. Within minutes, someone would sigh, another would apologize, and before long, we would be whispering again. That bed witnessed our growing pains. It was where Anne first cried over the weight of responsibilities she carried as the eldest, where Mary confessed her fear of never leaving the village, where I admitted I sometimes felt invisible in their shadow. It was where we clung to each other on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the cracks and branches scraped the windows. It was where we planned our mischief, sneaking apples from the neighbor's orchard or hiding behind hedgerows to scare the boys who teased us. The bed was more than a place to sleep. It was our stage, our sanctuary, our confessional. Looking back, I realize how deeply those nights shaped me. Listening to Anne's ambition taught me the value of striving for more. Listening to Mary's songs taught me the importance of beauty and gentleness. Sharing my own quiet hopes taught me that contentment is a dream too, one no less worthy than grand ambitions. In that cramped bed, beneath that single blanket, I learned that dreams come in many forms, and that each has its own dignity. As we grew older, life began to scatter us. Anne indeed became a teacher, moving to a nearby town where she could fulfill her calling. Mary sang at weddings and village gatherings, her voice cherished by everyone who heard it, though she never reached the grand stages she once imagined. I stayed closest to home, tending to family, creating the life I had once whispered about. But whenever we reunited, when the three of us sat together once more, laughter always rose quickly, as if we were still those girls under the blanket, whispering in the dark. Sometimes even now, I close my eyes and feel the weight of their presence on either side of me. Hear Anne's serious tone, Mary's soft hum, and my own shy voice weaving between theirs. Those nights remind me of the gift of closeness, of the comfort of knowing that no matter how cold the world outside became, there would always be two sisters pressed against me, sharing warmth, secrets, and love. That bed has long since disappeared. The iron frame rusted away, the mattress gone to dust, but in my memory, it remains strong and whole, holding us together through the years of our girlhood. When I think of it, I don't remember the discomfort, the lack of space, or the fights over blankets. I remember the whispers, the laughter, the soft murmur of dreams spoken into the night, and the unspoken promise that we would always be there for one another. That promise, forged in the quiet hours of childhood, has never left me. I carried my books with a piece of string. We couldn't afford proper satchels, and even if we could, it wouldn't have been considered necessary in our little village. Books were precious things, often passed down from one child to another, their pages already worn soft from many hands, corners folded, margins sometimes marked with faint pencil scribbles. I would stack mine carefully, bind them with the string, and carry them close against my chest as I walked the long lane to school. In the winter, my fingers would stiffen with cold, and the string would cut into my palms, but I never let the books slip. They were my ticket to something beyond the hedgerows and fields that surrounded us. Numbers never came easily to me. I would sit at the wooden desk, pencil in hand, staring at the sums that seemed to twist and tangle like stubborn knots I couldn't undo. I tried, oh how I tried, but my mind wandered whenever arithmetic appeared on the board. My teacher, a stern woman with kind eyes hidden behind spectacles, noticed my struggles. She never mocked me, but she pressed me to keep trying, telling me that persistence mattered more than quickness. I suppose she was right, though I never came to love numbers as she did. Stories, though, those were different. When a book of tales or scripture was placed before me, my whole being seemed to come alive. Words leapt from the page like sparks, and suddenly the small classroom walls stretched outward into worlds far larger than I could imagine. I read of kingdoms and deserts, of prophets and parables, of children who faced hardships and overcame them with courage. Each story felt like a doorway, and with every turn of the page, I stepped into another place. I could almost feel the sand under my feet in the stories of the Israelites, hear the clang of swords in tales of brave kings, or taste the sweetness of manna that fell from the sky. Scripture, especially, wrapped itself around my heart. I loved not only the lessons but the music of the language. The words carried a rhythm that stayed with me long after I closed the book. I would copy verses carefully in my notebook, my handwriting uneven but my attention unwavering. At night, I sometimes whispered those verses to myself under the blanket I shared with my sisters, finding comfort in the idea that those words had been spoken for generations before me and would be spoken for generations after. One day, when I was perhaps 9 or 10, the teacher asked me to stand and read aloud from the Gospel. My hands trembled as I held the book, the letters swimming a little before my eyes. But once I began, my voice grew steadier, rising with the cadences of the story. When I finished, the room was unusually quiet, and I saw something new in the teacher's eyes, a softness, a recognition. "You have a gift with words, Margaret," she said. I carried that praise home with me as though it were a jewel tucked in my pocket, something I could take out and admire whenever I felt unsure of myself. At school, the other children often teased each other for mistakes, but when it came to stories, even the roughest among them would fall silent, listening. That taught me early on that stories have power. They hush quarrels, awaken wonder, and sometimes even soothe sorrow. I think in many ways my love for stories became my shield. When I faltered with numbers and felt clumsy or foolish, I reminded myself that I had something else, an ability to see and feel through words. The walk home from school was often my favorite part of the day. Books bound with string pressed against me. I would rehearse the stories in my mind, telling them again as if they were my own. Sometimes I shared them with my sisters, embellishing details, making them laugh or gasp. Other times I kept them close, letting them turn over quietly in my thoughts. Stories were more than lessons. They were companions. My mother noticed my fondness for reading. Though she was often too busy to sit with me for long, she encouraged it, saying that a mind filled with scripture and good stories was never poor. On evenings when the work was done and the fire burned low, she sometimes asked me to read aloud. My father, weary from the fields, would sit back in his chair, eyes closed, listening to my voice carry the words. I felt proud in those moments, as though I were offering them something of value, even though all I was doing was reading from the worn pages of a book. Those early years taught me that education isn't only about mastering every subject. I may have stumbled over arithmetic and felt my cheeks burn when asked to recite multiplication tables, but I found confidence in the stories that sang to me from the pages. They gave me a sense of place in the world, a feeling that even a girl in a stone cottage with ivy on the walls could hold vast kingdoms and eternal truths in her heart. Later in life, when I raised my own children, I told them the same thing I had once told myself. Numbers matter, yes, but stories shape you. Stories remind you who you are, where you come from, and what kind of person you want to be. And when life feels too small or too heavy, a story can lift you, carry you to another place, and return you home with fresh eyes. Even now, at 67, I can close my eyes and see myself walking that lane, string biting into my fingers, books pressed tight against me, heart eager for the worlds waiting inside. It didn't matter that the books were worn, that the pages smelled faintly of damp, or that I sometimes stumbled over words. What mattered was that those books made my world bigger. They opened windows in the walls of my little life, windows through which the light poured in, showing me not only what was, but what could be. And for a girl who sometimes felt small and uncertain, that was enough to keep her moving forward, day after day, with books tied neatly under her arm. When I was 10, my grandmother gave me her recipe book. It wasn't new or fancy, nothing like the glossy cookbooks people keep on their shelves now. It was a thick, worn notebook, its cover faded and edges curled, with pages spotted by time and splashes of gravy, butter, and flour. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes hurried, sometimes graceful, each recipe written in her careful script. Some had little notes in the margins, instructions like add more milk if too thick, or best with apples picked early. When she placed it in my hands, I felt the weight of it, more than just paper and ink. It felt like she had handed me part of herself. She looked at me with eyes full of meaning and said, "These meals will keep your family together." At the time, I didn't truly understand what she meant. To me, food was just food. Meals were things Mother placed on the table, steaming and fragrant, and we ate them without thinking too much about how they had come to be. But my grandmother's voice carried a seriousness that made me nod solemnly, as though I understood, though in truth, the wisdom of her words would only unfold much later in my life. At first, I treated the book like a treasure chest. I would flip through the pages slowly, smelling the faint scent of cinnamon that lingered in its folds, tracing my fingers over her handwriting. There were recipes for hearty stews, golden pies, fluffy breads, and sweet puddings. Some were familiar, dishes I had eaten on Sundays or at Christmas, while others were strange to me, recipes she must have remembered from her own childhood. Each page seemed alive, a memory preserved in ingredients and instructions. I began to experiment in the kitchen, often making a mess more than a meal. My hands were small, clumsy with flour, and I often misread her handwriting, adding too much salt or forgetting to stir long enough. Still, my grandmother encouraged me. "Mistakes are part of cooking," she told me, "and sometimes the mistakes taste better than what you planned." That was her way. Practical, patient, with a touch of humor that softened her lessons. One of the first recipes I tried was her apple pie. I remember peeling the apples with a dull knife, my fingers sticky with juice, the dough breaking under my rolling pin because I hadn't floured the surface properly. The pie came out lopsided, with filling spilling over the edges. But when I served it to my sisters, they clapped and devoured it as though it were the finest pie in the county. That night I felt a spark of what my grandmother had meant. The pie wasn't perfect, but it drew us together in laughter and warmth. As the years passed, that recipe book became more than a guide to cooking. It became a kind of compass for living. During times when money was tight, I would turn to her simple recipes, dishes that could stretch a little flour, a few potatoes, or a handful of beans into a meal that fed us all. On birthdays or holidays, I followed her instructions for cakes and roasts, and the table became a place of celebration. When sorrow struck, as it inevitably does in every family, I found comfort in stirring soups or kneading dough, my hands repeating the motions she had once taught me, grounding me in the familiar. Her recipes did what she promised. They kept my family together. Around the wooden table, with dishes steaming before us, we found connection. We talked about our days, shared our burdens, laughed at old stories, and sometimes cried over new losses. No matter what had happened outside the walls of our home, when we sat down to eat the meals born from that recipe book, we were reminded that we belonged to one another. I carried that book with me as I grew older. It moved from the cottage of my childhood to the home I built with my husband, its pages becoming more fragile with each passing year. I added my own notes in the margins, adjustments, substitutions, new recipes gifted by friends. The book grew into a living thing, layered with the lives of many hands and many kitchens. There were times, standing in my own kitchen with flour up to my elbows and children underfoot, when I thought of my grandmother's words again. I realized she hadn't meant that recipes alone had the power to hold a family. It was what happened around the food, the care put into preparing it, the act of gathering to share it, the conversations and silences that unfolded around the table. Food was the thread, but love was the fabric. When my children grew older, they too learned from that book. They tugged at my sleeve, asking to stir the pot or roll the dough, and I let them, even when it meant another mess to clean. I wanted them to feel what I had felt, the sense that cooking is not just a task but a gift, a way of saying, "You matter enough for me to feed you well." I told them about their great-grandmother, about her steady hands and wise words, and in that way, her presence continued in our home. Now, at 67, the book is fragile. Its spine is cracked, pages are loose, and some stains have blurred the ink until the words are nearly unreadable. But I don't mind. Its worn state is proof of its service, its role in shaping my family's story. Sometimes I wonder if I should copy the recipes into a newer notebook, something sturdier. But I always decide against it. The magic is in the old pages, in the splatters and smudges that tell their own story alongside the recipes. When I hold that book now, I feel the same weight I did when I was 10, only now I understand what my grandmother truly gave me. She handed me not just a collection of meals, but a way to nurture, to bind, to create a sense of belonging. She gave me a tradition, a legacy wrapped in butter and salt, in sugar and spice. I didn't know then how right she was, but I know it now with all my heart. Those meals really did keep my family together. They fed our bodies, yes, but more importantly, they fed our love for one another. And that, I believe, is the truest recipe of all. Sundays were unlike any other day of the week. I woke to the sound of church bells ringing in the distance, their chimes carrying across the fields and through the village lanes like a gentle summons. The bells always stirred something inside me, a mix of reverence and excitement, because Sunday meant more than just a service. It meant family, community, and a rhythm of life that gave us all something steady to hold on to. We prepared for Sunday from the night before. Saturday evening was a ritual in itself. Shoes polished until they gleamed, dresses laid out neatly, hair brushed smooth and plaited. My sisters and I would fuss over ribbons or collars, teasing each other if a hem was crooked or a button missing. Mother made sure our clothes were clean and presentable, even if they were patched in places, for she believed that how you appeared in the Lord's house reflected the respect you carried in your heart. Father would often remind us that it wasn't about showing off to the neighbors, but about offering our best to God. As a child, I didn't fully grasp the weight of those words, but I obeyed them with the seriousness children often bring to routine. On Sunday morning, the kitchen filled with the smell of porridge or sometimes bread baked the day before. We ate quickly but not carelessly, for the meal had to be finished in time to make the walk to church. I remember the feel of the cool morning air as we stepped outside, our shoes crunching on the gravel, our breath forming little clouds if it was winter. The lane stretched before us, lined with hedgerows, and other families emerged from their homes as well, everyone converging toward the same place. There was something deeply comforting in that, a sense that no matter our struggles during the week, on Sunday we were all part of something larger than ourselves. The church stood tall at the edge of the village, its stone walls weathered but strong, ivy climbing up the sides, and stained glass windows glowing with the first light of the day. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of wood polish and candle wax. I loved the hush that fell over the congregation as we took our seats in the wooden pews, the creak of the benches echoing as people settled in. There was always a moment, just before the service began, when everything seemed suspended, as though the whole world was holding its breath. The hymns were my favorite part. I wasn't the loudest singer, but I sang with all my heart, the words filling me up in a way little else could. My sister Mary's voice often rose above the rest, clear and sweet, and sometimes I turned my head just to watch her face as she sang, her eyes closed in devotion. Those hymns stitched themselves into my memory, and even now, decades later, I can recall the melodies without effort. When life has felt heavy, I have often caught myself humming them, and they have carried me through. The sermons were harder for me as a child. Sitting still was not my strength, and though I tried to focus on the preacher's words, my mind sometimes wandered. I would trace the patterns in the stained glass or count the knots in the wooden pews. Yet, even when I didn't fully understand, something of the message sank into me. The rhythm of Scripture, the steady cadence of truth spoken aloud, worked its way into my bones. Later in life, when I faced trials, I found that those very words rose to the surface, reminding me of strength, patience, and faith. After the service, the churchyard came alive with chatter. Neighbors lingered, greeting one another, exchanging news, offering kind words. It was more than politeness. It was community, woven together week by week. Children darted between the gravestones, playing until their parents called them back. The older folk stood in clusters, speaking of harvests, illnesses, or births. My parents would always pause to speak with nearly everyone, and though I sometimes grew impatient to be home, I see now how those conversations mattered. They were the threads that tied us all together, a reminder that none of us lived in isolation. Sundays at home carried their own flavor, too. After church, the meal was often special, something we had looked forward to all week. Sometimes it was roast chicken if we'd been lucky, or a pie with vegetables from the garden, or even just a loaf of bread with butter and jam, eaten slowly and with gratitude. Whatever the fare, it tasted better because it was Sunday. Father would say grace with a little more feeling, his voice low and steady, and we all bowed our heads with a deeper stillness. The afternoons were for rest. Father often read from the Bible or nodded off in his chair. Mother mended clothes or wrote letters, and we children played quietly or read. It was not a day for rushing or fussing, but for peace. The stillness of those afternoons etched itself into me, teaching me that rest is not laziness but reverence, an acknowledgement that we are more than our work. Evening brought its own quiet ritual. Sometimes we returned to church for evensong. Other times we gathered around the fire at home. We sang, we read scripture, and we talked about the week to come. There was always a sense of renewal, as though Sunday had reset the world, preparing us to face whatever lay ahead. Looking back now, I understand more clearly what Sundays truly gave us. They were not just about faith, though faith was at the center of everything. They were about rhythm, about pausing in the midst of life's labor to remember what mattered most. They were about community, family, and gratitude. They gave me roots that held fast even when the storms of life tried to shake me. Even today, when I hear church bells in the distance, I am carried back to those mornings of polished shoes, steaming porridge, and voices lifted together in song. The memories are so vivid I can almost smell the candle wax, almost feel the pew beneath my hands, almost taste the Sunday meal waiting at home. And though time has carried me far from that little village and its ivy-clad church, the lessons remain. Sundays taught me that faith is not just a matter of words, but of living, week by week, with intention. They taught me that family thrives not only on work and duty, but on shared moments of peace. And they taught me that no matter how small or simple your life may seem, when you gather with others in love and reverence, you touch something eternal. Harvest season was the busiest time of the year, and in many ways, it was also the most beautiful. The fields that had looked so quiet and green through the summer suddenly became alive with purpose. Everywhere you turned, there were people working, men bending low to cut the wheat, women gathering bundles, children running with baskets or chasing after strays of straw. The air itself seemed different then, filled with the smell of cut grain, earth, and sweat, with the sound of voices calling across the fields and tools clinking against one another. As children, we were expected to help as soon as we were strong enough to carry even a small load. I remember my sisters and I following behind the adults, our skirts brushing against the stubble, our hands itching to be useful. We started with simple tasks, gathering the loose stalks, tying them into bundles, or carrying water jugs to the men working under the relentless sun. Though our roles were small, we felt important, part of something larger than ourselves. The harvest belonged to everyone, and everyone's hands were needed. It was hard work, far harder than anything I did in school or at home, but there was joy in it too. The rhythm of bending, lifting, tying, it became almost like a dance, and when we all moved together, the field slowly transformed before our eyes. One corner after another was cleared, and the golden sheaves stood upright in neat rows like soldiers ready for inspection. Watching the progress gave me a deep satisfaction. It was proof that effort, no matter how exhausting, bore fruit when shared. There were moments of weariness, of course. The sun would beat down until our faces flushed and our backs ached, and I remember wanting to lie in the shade and forget my duties. But just when I thought I couldn't manage another bundle, someone, usually my grandmother or mother, would place a firm hand on my shoulder and say, "One more, child. Just one more." And somehow, one more always led to another, until the day's work was done. I learned then that most of life is not about grand leaps, but about taking one more step, giving one more effort, even when you feel spent. Food was the great comfort of harvest time. Midday, the women would spread cloths on the grass and set out baskets of bread, cheese, pickles, and sometimes a meat pie if fortune had smiled on us. We would gather in circles, laughing and talking as we ate, our fingers dusty with flour or dirt. Nothing ever tasted as good as those meals in the open air, with the sun warming our faces and the scent of grain all around us. We ate heartily, knowing we needed the strength to return to the field. Those meals carried more than nourishment. They carried a sense of camaraderie, of being bound together not only by family but by shared labor. Evenings at harvest had their own magic. As the sun sank low, the fields glowed golden, the cut wheat catching the last rays of light. We would walk home with tired legs but light hearts, our hands scratched from straw, our clothes clinging with dust. At home, the work didn't end. There were tools to clean, baskets to stack, and meals to prepare. But there was also music. My father often brought out his fiddle, and neighbors would come by, filling our cottage with song and dance. Tired as we were, we found energy in those moments, laughing until our sides ached, clapping along to the rhythm. It was as though the land itself was celebrating with us. Harvest was not only about work and merriment, though. It taught us the fragility of life's blessings. One year, heavy rains ruined nearly half the crop. I remember the silence that hung in the air when Father returned from the field, his face drawn. Food would be scarce that winter, and the worry etched itself onto every adult's face. But even then, we gathered. We prayed and we shared what we had. We tightened our belts, leaned on one another, and endured. Those difficult years taught me that abundance is not guaranteed, but gratitude can exist even in scarcity. The harvest also instilled in me a sense of respect for the land. We were reminded again and again that what we took from it must be cared for, that fields needed rest as much as people did, and that without patience and diligence, there would be no yield. Those lessons sank deeper than I realized at the time. They shaped how I came to see all of life, not just food, but love, work, and faith, as something sown, tended, and harvested with care. My sisters and I grew older, and our responsibilities in the harvest grew with us. Anne, being the eldest, took on more of the heavy lifting, her strength surprising everyone. Mary often sang as she worked, her voice floating over the fields, lifting tired spirits. I tried to follow their example, steady and willing, though sometimes I lagged behind, my arms aching. Yet together, we formed a team, teasing each other, sharing smiles, pushing one another to keep going. Those days bound us as sisters in a way few other experiences could. Now, when I look back, I see the harvest not only as a season of labor but as a season of memory, stamped with golden light and the smell of earth. It was the time when I learned discipline, resilience, and the joy of shared purpose. I learned that tiredness can be sweet when it comes from honest work, and that rest is all the more precious when it is earned. I learned that abundance is never to be taken for granted, and that even in lean years, love and unity are the truest harvest a family can gather. Even today, when I pass by fields shimmering with ripe grain, I feel that old pull in my chest. I remember the scratch of straw against my arms, the sound of my father's fiddle, the taste of bread eaten under the sun. I remember being a child in a world where work was hard, but life was simple, and every season, though demanding, brought its own blessings. The harvest was more than a time of gathering crops. It was a time of gathering love, strength, and gratitude. And those, I believe, are the harvests that endure. The first winter storm of each year always left a mark on my memory. It arrived with little warning, though the signs were there if you knew how to look for them. The sky would grow heavy and gray. Clouds layered thick like wool, and the air would turn sharp enough to sting your lungs when you breathed. Birds disappeared. vanishing into hedgerows or barns, and the animals in the fields grew restless. My grandmother would glance at the sky and mutter, "Snow's coming," with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the heavens. When the storm finally broke, it was as though the whole world shifted in an instant. One moment the fields lay bare and brown, the next they were covered in white, the snow falling so quickly you could hardly see the lane outside the window. The wind howled down the chimney, rattling the shutters, and pressed against the doors with an urgency that made the house creak. As a child, I found it both frightening and thrilling. The storm turned our small cottage into a fortress, a little island of warmth surrounded by a sea of whirling snow. Inside, we gathered close. Father stacked logs in the hearth until the fire roared, its crackling the only sound strong enough to rival the wind outside. Mother moved about the kitchen, wrapping shawls tighter around her shoulders as she stirred thick soups and checked the bread rising near the stove. The air was full of warmth, both from the fire and from the smells of food cooking. But the edges of the cottage still carried a chill. My sisters and I huddled together, wrapping blankets over our knees, our breath puffing in little clouds when we strayed too far from the hearth. The storm meant school was canceled, and though we rejoiced in our reprieve from lessons, the day was far from idle. Work had to be done even in a storm, sometimes especially in a storm. Father and I would bundle ourselves in heavy coats, scarves wound tightly, and step out into the blinding white to check on the animals. The snow stung our faces, clung to our lashes, and turned our boots into lumps of ice. I remember holding tight to Father's coat so I wouldn't lose my way. The snow swirling so thickly it was hard to tell where the ground ended and the sky began. The animals huddled together, their coats crusted with frost, their eyes wide and anxious. We laid down extra hay, broke the ice on their water troughs, and whispered soothing words to calm them. By the time we stumbled back into the cottage, my cheeks were numb, and I was grateful for the fire's embrace. Even with preparations, storms brought hardship. The roof sometimes leaked, dripping icy water into basins we placed beneath. The firewood stack shrank faster than we wished, and Father worried whether it would last the season. Food stores had to be guarded carefully. Dried beans, salted meats, root vegetables in the cellar, all rationed with care so that the storm, however long it lasted, would not leave us hungry. We children learned quickly that every scrap mattered. Wasting food was unthinkable, and we ate with gratitude, knowing each bite was earned by planning and hard work. But for all the challenges, the storm also gave us gifts. There was a strange peace in being cut off from the world, a pause in the ceaseless rhythm of work and school. With no one able to travel, the family was together, fully and without distraction. Evenings were filled with stories. Grandmother recalling winters of her own childhood. Father telling us about storms he had braved as a young man. Mother reading aloud from scripture by the flickering firelight. My sisters and I would curl close, listening, our imaginations painting vivid pictures of snowbound adventures. The storm outside might rage, but inside, we were safe, bound tightly by warmth and love. I learned endurance in those storms. I learned that sometimes you cannot change your circumstances. You cannot tell the snow to stop or the wind to ease. You can only prepare, endure, and wait with patience. I learned that endurance was not only physical, though it took strength to shovel paths or fetch wood in the bitter cold. It was also of the heart, to sit quietly, to trust that the storm would pass, to believe that spring would come again. That was endurance too. There were moments of wonder as well. When the storm finally settled and the world lay hushed under its white blanket, we would step outside and marvel. The fields stretched endlessly, sparkling like a sea of diamonds under the pale winter sun. The air was so still, so clear, that even our voices sounded louder. We would throw ourselves into the snow, making angels, or roll great balls of it to build snowmen, our laughter echoing across the frozen world. In those moments, the hardship of the storm seemed to vanish, replaced by joy and awe at the beauty it had left behind. Looking back, I see those storms as teachers. They taught me resilience, yes, but they also taught me gratitude. Gratitude for the warmth of the fire, for the roof over our heads, for the food in our bowls, and most of all, for the family gathered around me. Without the storm, perhaps I would not have noticed those blessings so keenly. It was the contrast, the raging cold outside against the steady warmth inside, that made me understand what truly mattered. Now, even in my later years, when I hear the wind rising and see snow drifting past my window, I think of those days. I remember my small hands holding Father's coat in the blizzard, the sound of my grandmother's voice telling stories, the glow of the fire on my sisters' faces. I remember that no storm, however fierce, lasted forever, and I remember the lesson that has guided me through many trials. When the storms of life rage, endure with patience, cling to those you love, and trust that calm will follow. My first true friend at school was a girl named Clara. I remember her vividly, the way her hair caught the sunlight, a little wild and untamed, and the mischievous spark in her eyes that seemed to say she knew secrets the rest of the world didn't. We met on the very first day of term, both of us trembling with nerves, clutching our little books tied with string, unsure of where we belonged in the crowded classroom. Clara was the first to smile at me, a small, secretive smile that instantly made me feel less alone. I smiled back, and from that moment, a friendship began that would shape not only my childhood, but the way I came to understand loyalty, trust, and companionship. At first, our friendship was built on small things. We shared pencils, swapped stories we had heard at home, and compared the scribbles we had made in the margins of our books. Clara had a way of making even the dullest arithmetic problems seem like a game. If I struggled to add or subtract, she would whisper hints, making it a challenge rather than a punishment. I would giggle and whisper back, and soon we were quietly laughing under our desks, careful not to attract the teacher's attention. Those whispered moments taught me something I would carry for life. True friends can turn hardships into joys simply by being by your side. We shared everything: lunches, secrets, and even worries. On days when I felt invisible or clumsy, when I stumbled over sums, or felt the sting of a teacher's disappointment, Clara would reach over and squeeze my hand, a silent promise that I was not alone. She had a way of knowing exactly what to say, or when to say nothing at all. Her presence was a comfort, steady and unwavering, like the wooden table in my home that had always held us together. I began to realize that friendship is as much about listening and holding space as it is about speaking or playing. Outside of school, we became inseparable. We explored the village together, running through the lanes, climbing the low trees at the edge of the field, and sharing dreams beneath the hedgerows. Clara loved stories as much as I did, and we would sit on the bank of the stream for hours, inventing tales of faraway kingdoms, brave adventurers, and magical creatures. Sometimes our stories blended with reality, pretending the ducks in the pond were dragons we had to negotiate with, or that the old oak tree at the edge of the meadow was a guardian of treasure. Through those games, I learned the power of imagination, the way friendship could create entire worlds that existed only in the shared minds of two children. Clara also taught me about courage. She was fearless in ways I was not. If a boy teased me or someone tried to push us aside, she would stand firm, sometimes shouting, sometimes using a clever trick to turn the situation around. I watched her and learned that courage wasn't just about facing danger. It was also about standing up for others, defending what you believed was right, and refusing to shrink from life's small injustices. It was a lesson I would carry well beyond our village schoolyard. We celebrated small victories together. When I brought home a good grade, Clara would clap and insist we skip around the yard, pretending we were dancing at a grand ball. When she herself achieved something, I would run alongside her, cheering as loudly as I could. In our companionship, We found a balance of encouragement and shared delight, a way of magnifying life's joys simply by being together. It was an early lesson in empathy, the knowledge that happiness grows when shared, and that success is sweeter when someone else's voice cheers for you. There were, of course, moments of quarrel. Friendship, even the closest, is never without friction. I remember one day when Clara borrowed a book I treasured and accidentally tore a page. I was furious, my cheeks burning, my heart pounding. She cried, begged my forgiveness, and tried to repair the page with trembling hands. At first, I resisted, but then I remembered all the times she had been there for me, the kindnesses and shared laughter. Slowly, I forgave her, realizing that friendship is also about patience, compassion, and understanding that mistakes do not erase love. That day, I learned that reconciliation is an essential part of any deep bond, a truth that has stayed with me all my life. Even as the years went by, and Clara and I faced different classes, different teachers, and eventually different paths in life, the foundation of our friendship remained. We wrote letters when we were separated by chores, by illness, or by the long summer holidays. We confided our hopes, our fears, and our first small heartbreaks, knowing that the other would read the words with care and honesty. That early friendship taught me the value of constancy, that true friends are steady, even when circumstances change, and that bonds formed in trust and shared experience can endure the passing of time. Looking back now, I see Clara as one of the first people who taught me about connection. She showed me that companionship can be a shelter, a source of joy, and a teacher all at once. Through her, I learned that friends are chosen family, that the small acts of listening, sharing, and standing by one another matter more than grand gestures, and that life is immeasurably richer when you have someone with whom to share both the ordinary and the extraordinary. Even today, decades later, when I think of my childhood, I see Clara's face clearly, smiling at me across the schoolyard, a hand extended in friendship, and I realize that the lessons I learned from her, the patience, courage, loyalty, and laughter, have informed every relationship I've had since. True friendship, I understand now, is a gift and a mirror. It shows you who you are while helping you become the person you hope to be. I learned patience in the garden, working side by side with my mother and grandmother. Our garden wasn't large, but it was alive with possibilities, rows of vegetables, herbs tucked into corners, flowers that bloomed bright against the rough stone walls of the cottage. My grandmother would lead the way, her hands steady and sure, planting seeds with care, showing me how deep to press them into the soil, how far apart to space them so each could grow without crowding its neighbor. "Patience, Margaret," she would say, her voice gentle but firm. Nothing good comes overnight. At 10, I didn't fully grasp what she meant, but I listened, eager to do everything just as she instructed. Mother was quieter, watching us, occasionally bending to pull a stubborn weed or tie a tomato plant to its stake. She had a way of noticing small details, the curl of a leaf, the early signs of disease, the way the soil responded to water. I tried to imitate her careful movements, noticing how she pressed lightly around a new sprout or brushed away the dirt so it could breathe. Together, the three of us formed a rhythm, our hands in the soil, our eyes on the tiny shoots that promised future meals. At first, I was impatient. I wanted instant results, to see the plants rise tall and bear fruit immediately. I would check the ground every morning, lifting the soil to see if the seeds had sprouted yet, tapping the dirt gently to hurry them along. My grandmother would sigh, smiling with patience I could not yet summon. "You cannot force growth, child," she said. "The seed knows its own time. You just give it water, sun, and care, and it will do the rest." Slowly, I began to understand that patience wasn't simply waiting. It was actively nurturing, tending, and trusting the process even when nothing appeared to be happening. Spring was the hardest season for patience. The soil was soft, ready for planting, and every moment in the garden felt urgent. I would plant radishes, lettuce, and peas, imagining how quickly they should grow. When the first shoots appeared, I would cheer and watch with pride. But just as often, seeds didn't germinate, sprouts wilted, or the early sun scorched tender leaves. I would feel frustrated and sometimes tear at the soil, convinced I had failed. Then my grandmother would kneel beside me, brushing dirt from my hands and cheeks, and remind me, nature does not answer to our hurry. Even mistakes have a lesson. In those moments, I learned that patience includes humility, recognizing that not everything is within your control, and that mistakes, too, have value. By summer, the garden began to reward our care. Tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, beans climbed their supports, and the air smelled sweet with herbs like basil and mint. My mother taught me how to harvest carefully, selecting only the ripest produce so that the plants could continue to grow. We would gather our bounty in baskets, the weight of the vegetables in my hands a tangible reminder that growth, sustained over time, yields results. I began to see the connection between effort, patience, and reward, not just in the garden, but in life. The garden also taught me endurance. Some days were long and hot, others wet and muddy. Rain would soak us through, and the soil would stick to our knees and hands. Bugs crawled on my arms, and the sun left my nose red and raw. But each day, no matter the discomfort, we returned to the garden, planting, watering, weeding, and tending. I learned that perseverance, combined with patience, is what transforms small acts into lasting results. It wasn't enough to plant once. We had to care continuously, to return day after day with consistent attention. Working in the garden also nurtured my sense of observation. I began to notice patterns. The way certain plants leaned toward the sun, how flowers bloomed in response to rainfall, how weeds could take hold if not removed quickly. These lessons, though simple, taught me to pay attention, to see beyond the surface, to anticipate what might be needed before the need became urgent. I realized that patience involves more than waiting. It involves awareness, understanding, and careful action. By late summer, our garden became a place of abundance. We would take our harvest to the table, preparing meals that were fresh and nourishing. My grandmother's recipe book came into play here, teaching me to transform the fruits of our labor into food that could feed and sustain the family. I learned that patience in planting translated to joy and satisfaction at the table. Each meal carried not just flavor, but the story of effort, care, and growth, a story I shared with my sisters, parents, and later, my own children. There was also a quiet magic in the garden. At dawn, dew sparkled on leaves like tiny jewels. In the evenings, the air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers, and the sound of crickets or the occasional owl filled the space between rows of vegetables. I would linger after our work was done, brushing soil from my hands and watching the sun dip low, reflecting gold on the leaves. In those moments, I felt a deep connection to the land, to my family, and to the rhythms of life itself. I understood that patience is not only practical, it is also spiritual. It teaches reverence for the small, steady processes that shape our world. Now looking back, I see that the lessons from the garden stayed with me long after the soil had been tilled and the last harvest gathered. I learned that growth in any part of life, be it a plant, a skill, or a relationship, cannot be rushed. It requires care, attention, and trust in the natural order of things. I learned that patience is not passive. It is active, engaged, and persistent. And I learned that the quiet, steady work done day by day forms the foundation of anything worth achieving. The garden was my classroom before I ever understood what a classroom truly was. My mother and grandmother were my teachers, guiding me gently, showing me how to care, how to wait, and how to nurture. And in that soil, under the sun, in the quiet moments of planting and harvesting, I learned lessons that shaped not only the woman I would become, but the mother and grandmother I would one day be. The first time I baked bread alone, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear that I had never known before. I had watched my grandmother countless times, her hands skilled and sure as she kneaded dough, her voice soft with instruction, her eyes always alert to the slightest change in texture or temperature. I had helped her often, measuring flour, cracking eggs, stirring mixtures, but never had I taken on the task entirely myself. That morning, when she handed me the heavy wooden bowl and said, "Today, Margaret, it is your turn," I felt my heart leap and my hands tremble all at once. I washed them carefully, rolled up my sleeves, and began. The flour felt cold and soft against my palms, almost like snow, and the yeast smelled faintly sweet and alive. I mixed water and yeast, stirring slowly, then added the flour a little at a time. My grandmother's instructions echoed in my head. Not too fast, not too slow. Treat the dough gently, and it will reward you. I followed each step with painstaking care, my small hands gradually gaining confidence as I worked. Kneading was the hardest part. The dough resisted at first, sticking to my fingers, rolling unevenly across the board. I pushed, folded, and pressed, my arms tiring quickly. But I remembered her hands, how they moved with patience, and I tried to imitate her motions. Slowly, the dough became pliable, smooth and elastic, a warm, living thing responding to my touch. I was careful to listen to it, to feel when it was ready, and a strange pride swelled in my chest as I realized that it was, in fact, responding. I was doing it. Shaping the loaf was another delicate step. I had watched her tuck and fold with precision, turning a simple mass of dough into something elegant, something that promised sustenance. My first attempts were awkward. The dough sagged, uneven, and too loose in places. But I persisted, adjusting my technique, reshaping until it felt right. My grandmother offered occasional words of encouragement, and though she did not correct me too often, her presence was a steady comfort, a safety net beneath my fledgling efforts. The baking itself was magical. Sliding the loaf into the hot oven, I felt a thrill that was almost like sending a living creature into a warm, protective chamber. I watched through the small window, mesmerized by the transformation. The dough rose steadily, golden crust forming on top, the smell of baking bread filling the kitchen, mingling with the lingering scent of morning fire and herbs from the windowsill. My stomach growled, but I didn't mind. The anticipation was part of the joy. When the loaf was finally done, I pulled it out with trembling hands. Steam rose in a gentle cloud, warming my face, and the crust was firm and golden, a perfect balance of crisp and softness. I felt a wave of triumph that I had never known before, a sense of accomplishment not just in completing a task, but in creating something that would nourish others. I carried it carefully to the table, proud and slightly nervous, wondering if it would live up to my grandmother's standards. Mother, father, and my sisters gathered around, curious about my first solo effort. I sliced the bread with careful precision, the knife cutting through the crust to reveal the soft, warm interior. My family tasted it, and their eyes lit up with approval. My grandmother smiled, the kind of smile that carries both pride and gentle reassurance. "You've done well, Margaret," she said simply. And in that moment, I understood what she had always meant by teaching. It wasn't just about learning a skill. It was about learning responsibility, care, and love through action. Baking bread alone taught me more than I expected. I learned patience, as I had with the garden, because nothing could be rushed. The dough, the rising, the baking, all required time and attention. I learned focus, because each step demanded my full presence. A mistake could ruin the whole loaf, and I learned humility, because even when I succeeded, I knew that mastery came not from one day, but from countless mornings, years of watching, practicing, and learning from those who had gone before me. It also taught me about nourishment in a deeper sense. Bread is more than food. It carries the warmth of the hands that made it, the care put into each stage, the love embedded in the act of preparing it for others. When I served slices to my sisters, sharing a meal made with my own effort, I realized that creating sustenance is a form of devotion, a way of saying, without words, I care for you, and I am here for you. That understanding stayed with me through every meal I prepared thereafter. Even the mistakes were lessons. My first loaf had small air bubbles where the dough had risen too quickly in some spots, and one edge was a little overbaked. But those imperfections taught me to observe, to adapt, to pay closer attention next time. My grandmother would say, "Every loaf teaches you something new, Margaret. Never fear the mistakes, for they are part of learning." I learned to embrace imperfection as part of growth, a lesson far more important than a perfect crust. From that day on, baking bread became a ritual of creation, patience, and care. Every time I kneaded dough, I thought of that first loaf, of the thrill and fear, of the warmth of the oven, and the smell that filled the kitchen. I thought of my family gathered around the table, their faces lighting up with simple joy. And I understood that the true reward of bread was never only in taste. It was in connection. Even now, decades later, when I bake bread for my children or grandchildren, I remember that first time I did it alone. The lessons I learned then, the patience, the care, the humility, and the love, are the ones that guide me every time I step into the kitchen. Baking bread is no longer just a task. It is a reminder of how I learned to create, to nurture, and to give from the heart. I remember the day I first read aloud in public as though it were yesterday, though decades have passed. It was at our little village school, in the main hall with its high ceilings and wooden benches that creaked under the weight of the children seated upon them. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust, polished wood, and the ink of countless notebooks. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement because I had been chosen to read a passage from Scripture during the assembly, a task I both dreaded and secretly longed for. I had spent the previous night practicing, whispering the words to myself by the flickering candlelight, feeling the rhythm and cadence of each sentence. My grandmother had watched me, nodding with approval, but she had also offered caution. "Speak with your heart, Margaret, not just your voice. Let the words come alive," she said. I had repeated it over and over, imagining the congregation of children, teachers, and parents listening to my voice. My stomach fluttered nervously, and I could not help but imagine myself stumbling over the letters, my voice quivering until it broke completely. The morning arrived, crisp and clear, and we filed into the hall, rows of children sitting obediently while parents and villagers filled the back. I took my place at the podium, the small wooden lectern cold beneath my palms. The hall seemed impossibly large, and the faces staring at me felt as if they were carved from stone, waiting for me to falter. I took a deep breath, remembering my grandmother's words, feeling the familiar warmth of her guidance wrap around me, even though she was not physically present that day. When I began to read, my voice was unsteady at first. The words seemed to leap awkwardly from my mouth, each one heavier than I expected. I felt the sweat prickling my brow and the trembling in my fingers. But I pressed on. Gradually, as I found the rhythm in the scripture, my voice grew steadier. I began to see faces soften, eyes brightening, children leaning forward in their benches, and teachers nodding encouragement. The passage, which had seemed daunting at first, became a bridge connecting me to everyone in that room. My voice carried not just the words, but my intention, my care, and my belief in their meaning. There was a moment, halfway through, when my confidence wavered. A cough rippled through the audience, and I felt the familiar surge of doubt creeping back in. But then I remembered how my grandmother had taught me to trust in the rhythm of the words, to let them guide me rather than trying to control every syllable. I inhaled deeply and let the next lines flow naturally, my voice rising and falling like a melody, finding strength in the practice I had repeated so many times. By the time I finished, a silence had settled in the hall, thick and expectant, and then gradually, applause began, gentle at first, then louder, until the entire room seemed to hum with it. I felt a warmth spread through me, a combination of relief and pride. I had done it. I had stood before a room full of people and let my voice carry meaning. I saw my mother in the back, her hand pressed to her chest, eyes shining. I imagined my grandmother smiling, somewhere in her heart, knowing that I had learned to trust myself. The applause was not simply for the reading, I realized, but for the courage it took to step into the unknown, to speak when fear demanded silence. That day, I learned that reading aloud was more than pronouncing words correctly. It was about presence, about intention, and about connection. Every pause, every rise and fall of the voice, every careful emphasis mattered. The scripture was alive, and by giving it voice, I brought it to life for everyone who listened. I also learned something about myself, that I could face fear, that I could stand tall in moments of vulnerability, and that the voice I had been given was a tool to reach others, to comfort, inspire, and teach. From then on, I found myself more willing to speak in public, to read aloud in the classroom, and later, in gatherings at the church or community events. Each time, I carried with me the memory of that first reading, the fear that had nearly paralyzed me, and the triumph that had followed. I realized that courage is built in small steps, each act of bravery reinforcing the last. That first experience was not just about reading a passage. It was about discovering that I could rely on myself, that preparation, patience, and heart could carry me through even the most intimidating moments. The lesson extended beyond reading aloud. I began to see that life itself often requires us to step into the unknown, to let our voices be heard even when uncertainty makes them tremble. The first reading taught me to trust in my preparation, to embrace imperfection, and to understand that connection comes from sincerity more than perfection. It was a lesson that guided me through school, through my first jobs, and into motherhood and grandmotherhood. Even now, at 67, I can recall the feel of the lectern beneath my hands, the faces before me, the rhythm of the words flowing from my lips. I remember the fear, the tremor, and the eventual confidence that arose, like a small flame lighting a dark corner. That experience, though brief in the span of a day, has remained with me all my life. A reminder that courage is built one step at a time, that voice carries power, and that the willingness to speak opens doors not only for ourselves, but for those who hear us. I learned to sew under the careful watch of my Nana, and those lessons were among the most delicate and enduring of my childhood. Our cottage had a small room at the back that served as a sewing corner, with a wooden table littered with spools of thread, needles, scraps of fabric, and scraps of wisdom stitched between tasks. Nana would sit there for hours, her hands moving with a practiced grace that made every stitch seem effortless, though I knew it was the result of decades of dedication. I remember watching her first, my small hands folded in my lap, absorbing every motion, how she threaded the needle, how she pulled the thread through fabric without creating tangles, how she tied knots that would hold through time and wear. My first attempt at sewing was humble, a small handkerchief for my grandmother's birthday. Nana handed me a needle and thread, her eyes calm and encouraging. "Take your time, Margaret. Do not rush. The fabric will tell you what it needs," she said. I nodded eagerly, though a tremor of nervousness ran through my fingers. I pricked myself more than once, yelping in surprise, and Nana laughed softly, guiding my hands with patience. "Every mistake is a lesson, child. Do not fear it," she reminded me. I realized then that sewing was as much about patience and focus as it was about dexterity. At first, my stitches were uneven and wobbly. Some were too long, others barely caught the fabric. Nana would gently pull the thread out and show me how to do it again, emphasizing the rhythm, the steadiness of hand, and the importance of keeping one's eyes on the work while remaining mindful of one's movements. I learned to breathe with each stitch, to let my hands find a natural pace, and slowly, the small squares of fabric in front of me began to transform. Each stitch that held, each knot that stayed secure, filled me with pride. I understood then that persistence turns awkward beginnings into skillful accomplishments. As I gained confidence, Nana taught me more advanced techniques. We worked on hems, buttonholes, and even small repairs for the family's clothes. She showed me how to match thread to fabric, how to adjust tension so that seams would lie flat, and how to finish edges neatly to prevent fraying. Each lesson was practical, yet there was beauty in the precision. The careful alignment of stitches, the gentle tug to secure the seam, the satisfaction of turning out a neatly finished piece. It was as much an art as a craft. I began to see sewing not just as a chore, but as a form of creation, a way of giving life and care to objects that would last for years. Nana also taught me that sewing was an act of service. "Clothes hold more than your body," she would say. "They carry respect, warmth, and care. When you mend or create something for someone else, you give a piece of yourself." I internalized that lesson deeply. Every patch I stitched on a worn sock, every button I sewed on a frayed coat, felt like a small act of love. Sewing became not merely a skill, but a way to nurture the people I cared for. I realized that the time and attention put into making or repairing garments was a language of affection, one that required no words. There were moments of frustration, of course. Some fabrics were stiff, unyielding. Threads tangled or snapped. Buttons refused to stay put. I remember one afternoon trying to attach a tiny, delicate button to my mother's favorite blouse. My hands shook, the thread looped awkwardly, and I was certain I would ruin the garment. Nana's calm voice floated over me, patient and reassuring. "Slow down. Listen to the fabric. It will guide you." I exhaled, adjusted my grip, and tried again. The button finally stayed in place, small but perfect. I remembered the pride swelling in my chest and Nana's approving nod. It was a triumph not just over the fabric, but over my own impatience and doubt. Over time, I began to tackle more ambitious projects. A simple dress for my sister, a cloth doll, small quilts. Each project brought its own challenges, but Nana's guidance always reminded me that mastery comes from repeated effort, careful observation, and humility. I learned to take joy not only in the finished work, but in the process itself, the quiet, meditative rhythm of needle and thread, the satisfaction of shaping something with my own hands, the growing understanding that skill is built slowly, one stitch at a time. Sewing also became a shared activity, a space for storytelling. Nana would speak of her childhood, of the clothes she had sewn during harder times, of how she had learned from her own mother. We would laugh at tales of mismatched buttons or crooked hems, and I felt connected to a lineage of women who had passed down knowledge through patient hands. Sewing was both practical and spiritual. It was a link to family, to history, and to the values of diligence, care, and resilience. Now, decades later, when I pick up a needle, I think of those afternoons with Nana, the quiet lessons, the gentle corrections, and the pride in small achievements. Sewing taught me more than how to make a garment hold together. It taught me about patience, service, persistence, and attention to detail. Most importantly, it taught me that the things we create with care are not only useful, but carry love and intention. Each stitch, no matter how small, is a testament to time well spent and hands willing to nurture. Nana's sewing lessons shaped more than my skill with fabric. They shaped my understanding of life itself. I learned that careful, deliberate effort, combined with patience and love, creates beauty that endures. That lesson has guided me in countless ways, raising children, building a home, and caring for my family. Every stitch I make carries her wisdom, and every garment I mend reminds me that the simplest acts, done with intention, are often the most profound. I learned responsibility in no better place than the barn, caring for the animals that shared our small farm. It began with the chickens. I was only 8 years old the first time my father handed me a basket and said, "Margaret, it's your turn to collect the eggs." At first, I was terrified. The hens scattered at the slightest movement, clucking loudly and pecking at my feet. I remember flinching each time a wing brushed my arms or a beak came too close. But my father's calm voice guided me. "Gentle hands, Margaret. They are fragile, just like you must be with them." I took a deep breath and moved slowly, learning to bend with patience, to steady the basket, and to approach the birds with care. Collecting eggs was only the beginning. Each animal had its own needs and temperament. The goats were stubborn and clever, always testing the fences and the limits of my patience. The cows were large and imposing, requiring both respect and confidence when I helped milk them. Horses demanded consistency and understanding, their temperaments as varied as people's. I learned quickly that caring for animals was not about domination but about observation, empathy, and steady routine. Every action had consequences. A neglected feeding meant a hungry goat. A poorly secured gate could let a horse wander, and every small oversight could ripple into greater trouble. Morning chores became my responsibility. Long before the sun rose, I would be out in the barn, coiling the water bucket, filling troughs, and ensuring every animal was fed and safe. Sometimes the wind bit through my coat, or the snow made the path slippery, but the animals depended on me, and I could not fail them. I learned that responsibility is heavier when others rely on you, whether they are children, family, or creatures who cannot speak for themselves. There was no room for complaints or shortcuts. The work demanded consistency and dedication, day after day, season after season. I remember one particularly harsh winter when a storm trapped snow against the barn doors, and the animals grew restless and hungry. I struggled to clear the path, my fingers numbing in the cold, my boots slipping on icy ground. But I did not stop. I shoveled and carried water, coaxed the frightened goats, and comforted the shivering chickens. By the time I returned inside, soaked and exhausted, I realized that responsibility was not simply a duty. It was a moral choice. It required courage, endurance, and love, even when the work was difficult, and the reward not immediate. Caring for the animals also taught me patience. The first time I tried to milk a cow alone, I failed miserably. The cow grew restless, the milk sprayed in all directions, and I was covered in the sticky warmth of my own inexperience. My father laughed, not unkindly, and guided my hands. "Milk her gently, Margaret. Feel the rhythm. Listen to her body," he said. I tried again and again, learning to synchronize my movements with the animal's breathing and motions. Gradually, I succeeded, and the sense of accomplishment that followed was profound. I realized that mastery, whether of chores, skills, or life itself, comes only with persistence and attentive observation. The animals became more than responsibilities. They became teachers. I learned empathy from the frightened lamb that trembled in my arms, loyalty from the old dog who followed me everywhere, and trust from the hens who finally allowed me to approach without panic. Each creature had a personality, a way of communicating without words. I learned to read their signals, to anticipate their needs, and to respond appropriately. In turn, they responded to me with a quiet acceptance, a bond formed from respect and care. Through tending animals, I also learned humility. No matter how clever or strong I became, I could not control the weather, the seasons, or the unpredictable moods of living creatures. Illness struck suddenly, accidents happened, and losses were inevitable. These moments taught me to accept what I could not change and to act wisely with what I could. I understood that responsibility involves not only action, but also foresight, compassion, and the ability to adapt. Even the small lessons mattered. I learned to sweep the barn properly so that dust and straw did not harm the animals' feet, to check the fences regularly for gaps, and to notice subtle changes in behavior that might signal illness. Each small task, repeated daily, taught discipline, mindfulness, and the cumulative power of careful attention. Responsibility, I realized, is built in tiny, consistent acts, not in grand gestures alone. Caring for animals also strengthened my sense of gratitude. I learned to appreciate life in all its forms, from the smallest chick to the largest cow. I understood that every living thing has value, that each effort to nurture is significant, and that the bond between caretaker and creature is reciprocal. The animals relied on me, yes, but they also gave me lessons, joy and companionship that no human could replicate. Looking back now, I see that tending to the animals was more than farm work. It was a formative experience that shaped my character, my sense of duty, and my understanding of love expressed through action. It taught me that responsibility is not a burden, but a privilege, that care and attention create trust and connection, and that even the smallest acts of kindness have lasting impact. These lessons stayed with me into adulthood, guiding how I cared for my family, how I approached challenges, and how I valued every living being in my world. Even today, when I see an animal in need, a stray cat, a wounded bird, or a neighbor's struggling livestock, I feel that same sense of duty that began in the barn. The lessons learned from those chickens, goats, cows, and horses are etched into my heart. Patience, empathy, consistency, and love. Responsibility, I have come to understand, is never just about completing a task. It is about nurturing life, honoring trust, and growing alongside those who depend on you. I first went fishing with my father when I was 9, and that day remains etched in my memory like the glint of sunlight on a rippling river. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine from the surrounding woods. My father carried the fishing rods over his shoulder, his hands steady and sure, while I struggled to keep up, my small boots squelching in the mud along the riverbank. I was nervous, unsure of what to expect, but eager to learn. Fishing, my father said, was about more than catching fish. It was about patience, observation, and respect for the natural world. The river itself seemed alive, murmuring over stones and reflecting the pale blue of the sky. My father taught me to watch the water carefully, to notice the subtle ripples and movements that might indicate fish beneath the surface. Fishing is about reading signs, Margaret, he said. The river speaks to those who are patient enough to listen. I strained my eyes, trying to detect every flicker and shadow, every tiny disturbance that could mean a nibble, a hint of life beneath the surface. At first it seemed impossible. The water was endless, and I felt small and clumsy in comparison to the river's vastness. Casting the line was another challenge. My father demonstrated the motion, his arm swinging gracefully, the line arcing over the water with a precision I could only envy. I mimicked him, and my first attempts ended with tangled lines and splashes, the hook landing uncomfortably close to my feet. My father chuckled and encouraged me. Try again, Margaret. Pay attention, and trust your movements. Slowly, I found a rhythm, my throws growing steadier, the line landing farther and truer. I learned then that skill comes not from brute strength, but from practice, observation, and patience. Waiting for a bite was perhaps the hardest part. I would grip the rod tightly, my knuckles white, eyes fixed on the bobber, willing it to move. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I grew restless, shifting my feet, letting my mind wander. My father, calm as the river itself, sat beside me and whispered, "Patience is the greatest part of fishing, child. You cannot rush it. Learn to wait, and the river will reward you." Those words sank deeply. I began to breathe slowly, to watch the water with quiet attention, and to notice details I had overlooked before. The way sunlight danced across ripples, the pattern of birds swooping above, the whisper of wind through the reeds. Fishing became less about the catch and more about presence, a meditation in motion. Finally, a tug on the line sent a jolt through my hands, startling me. I froze, unsure what to do. My father's steady voice guided me. "Reel in slowly, don't pull. Let the fish tire itself out." My hands shook, but I followed his instructions. The fish struggled, splashing water and tugging at the line, and I felt a mixture of fear, excitement, and exhilaration. With careful effort, I finally brought the fish to shore, wet and wriggling, a silver flash of life. Pride and joy surged through me. This was the reward for my patience, attention, and persistence. My father smiled, nodding approvingly. "You've done well, Margaret. You've learned the river's language." Fishing taught me lessons far beyond catching fish. It taught me patience, the ability to wait without frustration, to observe without judgment, and to act without haste. It taught me the importance of mindfulness, of paying attention to small details, of noticing what others might miss. The river demanded respect, and I learned humility in its presence. Sometimes we caught nothing, and sometimes the fish we wanted eluded us entirely. Those moments were not failures. They were reminders that life, like the river, moves according to its own rhythm, and that perseverance often brings rewards in unexpected forms. I also learned to appreciate the interconnectedness of life. Watching the fish glide beneath the surface, seeing the birds swoop for insects, hearing the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the woods, I felt part of something larger. The river gave sustenance, yes, but it also offered lessons in balance, timing, and patience. I realized that every creature, every ripple, and every gust of wind played a role in the ecosystem, and our presence mattered as well. We were participants, not controllers. Through fishing with my father, I discovered the quiet joy of shared experience. We spoke little, mostly exchanging glances, small instructions, or soft laughter. Yet those hours forged a bond between us, strengthened by cooperation and trust. He guided me, corrected me when I faltered, and celebrated with me when I succeeded, teaching by example what it meant to be patient, persistent, and respectful. The lessons I learned on that riverbank were not fleeting. They became principles I carried into every aspect of life. Even decades later, when I find myself near water, I feel the pull of that first fishing trip, the tug of expectation, the anticipation of discovery, the calm that comes from patience, observation, and reverence for nature. I remember the fish slipping into the net, the sunlight on the water, and the quiet pride in my father's eyes. Fishing was not merely a skill. It was a training in life, a guide for how to move through the world with patience, humility, and mindfulness. That day by the river taught me that life, like fishing, requires careful attention, trust in the process, and a willingness to wait for rewards. It taught me to appreciate effort as much as outcome, and to find joy in simple, steady acts. Most importantly, it taught me that some of the greatest lessons come not from instruction alone, but from doing, observing, and learning alongside those we love. I still remember the first snowball fight I ever had, a day so full of laughter and chaos that it remains vivid in my mind even now. The snowfall had begun overnight, covering the village in a thick white blanket. The trees were heavy with snow, the roofs of the cottages glistened like sugar, and every path seemed softened, muffled, as though the world itself had been transformed. My sisters and I awoke to the sight of this magical winter landscape and immediately ran outside, our breath forming little clouds, our boots sinking into powdery drifts. At first, we merely tossed small clumps at each other, tentative, careful, testing the weight of snow in our hands. But soon the game escalated. My sisters, Clara and Anne, teamed up against me, their laughter echoing across the yard. I gathered larger snowballs, crouching behind the low stone wall for cover, planning my counterattack with the seriousness of a general. The air was filled with flying snow, the cold biting at our cheeks and noses, and yet the joy in our hearts kept us warm. Every throw, every dodge, every squeal of surprise became part of a rhythm, a playful dance between strategy and spontaneity. I learned that day how joy could be simple and immediate. Nothing needed to be planned meticulously. The snow itself became our playground, our weapon, our toy. I discovered the thrill of movement, the exhilaration of running, ducking, and dodging with wild abandon. The snowball fight taught me that playfulness is not frivolous. It is essential. It reminded me that even in a world full of chores, duties, and expectations, there is space for laughter, for spontaneity, and for moments that belong entirely to the present. As the fight continued, I began to notice subtle lessons in strategy and observation. I learned to read my sister's movements, to anticipate their throws, to find cover behind fences and walls, and to make quick decisions in the moment. My small body became nimble, my reflexes sharper, my mind alert to patterns and possibilities. The snowball fight was not merely play. It was a lesson in awareness, timing, and agility. Even in laughter, I learned that attentiveness and clever thinking were invaluable. The cold eventually seeped into our bones, our fingers and toes growing numb despite our woolen gloves and thick socks. We trudged through drifts that reached past our knees, slipping and sliding, yet no one wanted to quit. My grandmother, watching from the porch with a steaming cup of tea, called out for us to come in, but we ignored her, caught up in the thrill of the game. She simply smiled, knowing that this was more than a fight. It was a memory being created, a lesson in joy, courage, and freedom. Even small acts of kindness appeared in the chaos. Sometimes a snowball would hit too hard, and one of us would stop to check the other's face for tears or red marks. We learned to balance competitiveness with care, understanding that fun should not come at the expense of others. That day, I discovered that playfulness and empathy could coexist, that one could be fierce in the game yet gentle in heart. This balance, I realized, applied far beyond snowball fights, shaping how I approached friendships, family, and life itself. By mid-afternoon, we were exhausted but exhilarated. Our clothes were soaked, our hair dusted with snow, our cheeks glowing from exertion and cold. We collapsed in a heap, laughing and gasping, our breath forming tiny clouds that mingled with the winter air. In those moments, I understood the transformative power of play, how it could release tension, build bonds, and remind us of the lightness of being alive. That first snowball fight was not just fun. It was a small awakening to the joy that can exist even amidst life's difficulties. Later, as we returned to the warmth of the cottage, our mother and grandmother dried our clothes and hands, but they also shared in our laughter, encouraging the stories of our triumphs and near misses. I realized that joy multiplies when it is shared, that memories created in play are strengthened by recounting them, and that happiness is as much about connection as it is about action. The snowball fight had been chaotic, loud, and messy, but it had bonded us, taught us patience in aiming, respect in taking turns, and creativity in finding cover and making strategies. Looking back now, I see that snowball fights and playful moments like it carry lessons that last a lifetime. They remind us to embrace spontaneity, to find joy in simple pleasures, and to balance competitiveness with care. They teach resilience, because even if we are hit or fall in the snow, we can rise and try again. And they remind us of the importance of laughter, of connection, and of memory. That first fight was not merely about snow. It was about learning to engage fully with life, to find delight in the present, and to honor the bonds we share with those we love. Even today, when I see snow beginning to fall, I feel a thrill of anticipation, recalling the exhilaration of that first battle, the joy of running and dodging, and the warmth of connection that followed. It is a reminder that childhood lessons can be found in the simplest of games, and that play is not a waste of time, but a cornerstone of a well-lived life. The snowball fight taught me courage, strategy, joy, empathy, and the enduring magic of living fully in each moment. My first experience helping with the harvest remains one of the most vivid memories of my childhood. It was late summer, the fields heavy with golden wheat and bright green vegetables, ready to be gathered before the coming frost. I remember waking before dawn, the air cool and filled with the scent of dew, and following my father and older brothers into the fields. I was small, barely able to lift the heavy bundles, but my heart was eager, and my hands itched to contribute. Nana had instructed me carefully. Every hand matters, Margaret, no matter how small. Harvest is a family, and every person helps the work succeed. At first, the work seemed endless. The wheat swayed taller than I was, its stalks brushing my arms as I bent to cut them. My fingers fumbled with the sickle, clumsy and unpracticed, and I often dropped bundles after gathering only a few stalks. My father watched me patiently, correcting my grip, guiding my movements, and reminding me to pace myself. Strength comes with practice, and the fields reward patience, he said. I began to realize that harvesting was not merely physical labor. It required attention, focus, and steady rhythm. Working alongside my family, I learned the importance of teamwork. Each person had a role. My father cut the tallest wheat, my mother sorted vegetables, my sisters gathered the ripest fruits, and the younger children carried smaller bundles to the barn. I discovered that cooperation, rather than individual speed, was what allowed the work to progress. When we helped each other, shared tasks, and encouraged one another, the harvest moved smoothly. I learned that collective effort, guided by patience and care, can accomplish what no one person could do alone. The physicality of the work was exhausting but also grounding. My hands were blistered and calloused by the end of the day. My back ached from bending and lifting, and the sun left my skin warm and rosy, yet in that exhaustion there was a profound satisfaction. I realized that effort invested in something tangible, something that sustains life, is meaningful in a way that play or study sometimes cannot replicate. Each bundle I lifted, each row I cleared, contributed to the sustenance of my family and community. The harvest taught me that labor is not just toil. It is a gift, a way to provide for others and to honor the earth's bounty. The harvest also taught me gratitude. Watching the fields, seeing the fruits of months of planting, tending, and waiting, I felt awe at the abundance of the land. Each ear of wheat, each bright vegetable, was a testament to growth, patience, and perseverance. I began to understand that nothing is effortless. The food on our table is the result of constant care, time, and labor. I learned to appreciate not just the product but the process, to respect the work that brings sustenance, and to recognize that gratitude is intertwined with awareness of effort and dedication. There were lessons in humility, too. Some days the weather was unkind. Rain soaked the fields, mud clung to our boots, and sometimes crops were damaged by wind or pests. On those days, we worked with even greater care, repairing what we could and salvaging the rest. I realized that life, like the harvest, is unpredictable, and we must approach it with diligence and acceptance. Even when challenges arise, steady effort and cooperation allow us to overcome difficulties. I learned that setbacks are not failures, but opportunities to adapt and persist. I also learned that joy can be found in hard work. Between the rows of wheat, my sisters and I would laugh, exchanging small jokes or racing to see who could gather the most stalks. Occasionally, we paused to lie on the cool earth and watch the clouds drift across the sky, catching our breath and feeling the warmth of the sun. These small moments of delight, embedded within responsibility, taught me that work and play are not opposites. they can coexist. Effort becomes more meaningful when shared, and accomplishment is sweeter when celebrated with others. By the end of the harvest, the barn was filled with bundles, baskets, and crates, each one a tangible sign of our collective effort. My hands were rough, my feet sore, and my body tired, yet I felt a deep pride and satisfaction unlike anything else. I had contributed meaningfully, learned the value of teamwork, experienced the rhythm of labor, and felt the joy of accomplishment. The harvest was more than a task. It was a lesson in life itself, in patience, cooperation, diligence, and gratitude. Even decades later, I recall that day with clarity. I remember the golden fields, the laughter of my sisters, the steady guidance of my parents, and the sense of being part of something larger than myself. Harvest taught me that every act of care, every shared effort, and every moment of persistence has lasting value. It showed me that gratitude grows from understanding effort, that cooperation strengthens bonds, and that joy can be found in both work and community. That first experience in the fields shaped not only my understanding of labor, but also my approach to life. I learned to respect the efforts of others, to contribute meaningfully, and to appreciate the fruits of patience and collaboration. The lessons of the harvest, teamwork, responsibility, gratitude, and joy in labor have guided me through adulthood, helping me nurture family, community, and the life I built. Even now, when I see fields ready for harvest, I feel that same connection, pride, and understanding, knowing that the work of many hands, performed with care and intention, creates abundance beyond measure. I first learned to knit when I was 10, and it was an experience that taught me far more than just the creation of scarves and mittens. Nana had a basket filled with colorful yarns and smooth wooden needles, each one polished from years of use. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, sunlight spilling over her shoulder, and motioned for me to sit beside her. "Knitting, Margaret, is not just about making cloth," she said gently. "It is about patience, focus, and seeing beauty grow from small, consistent effort." I nodded, excited but nervous, my fingers itching to begin. My first attempt was awkward. The yarn twisted, the stitches were uneven, and the needles slipped from my fingers more often than not. Nana's hands guided mine, correcting my grip, showing me how to loop the yarn properly, and reminding me to slow down. "Do not rush, child," she said. "Every stitch is a step, and every step matters." I realized immediately that knitting demanded a kind of quiet concentration I had not experienced before. I had to watch every movement, anticipate each loop, and maintain a rhythm that would allow the pattern to grow steadily. At first, progress was slow. I would knit one row, unravel two, and begin again. Frustration bubbled within me. I wanted to see the finished product immediately, to feel pride in a complete scarf or hat. But Nana's voice reminded me that mastery comes with practice. "Focus on each stitch, Margaret," she said. "The rest will follow. Knitting teaches patience more than speed." Slowly, I began to appreciate the process itself, the feel of the yarn slipping through my fingers, the subtle click of the needles, the rhythm of creation unfolding one loop at a time. Knitting also taught me perseverance. Some days my hands ached, and my eyes grew tired from following the pattern. I would drop stitches or make errors that required starting over, but each attempt brought me closer to competence. I discovered that persistence in small, repetitive tasks can yield results that seem miraculous over time. A few hours of concentrated effort transformed a loose skein of yarn into something purposeful, something tangible, something that could bring warmth to another person. As I gained skill, I began to create more intricate pieces. Simple scarves evolved into mittens and then small hats. Nana encouraged me to experiment with patterns, showing me how to combine colors, twist stitches, and create texture. I learned that creativity requires both discipline and imagination, that rules must be understood before they can be bent or broken. Every finished piece carried not only utility, but also artistry, and I took pride in knowing that my own hands had shaped it. Beyond skill, knitting taught me mindfulness. Each stitch demanded attention, and each error required correction. I learned to slow my thoughts, to breathe steadily, and to immerse myself fully in the task at hand. In those quiet hours with needles and yarn, I discovered a meditative rhythm, a way to calm my mind while building something real. It was a lesson I carried beyond knitting, applying the same focus and patience to reading, learning, and later, to nurturing my own children. Knitting also reinforced the value of care in giving. The scarves, mittens, and hats I made were not for myself, but for my sisters, cousins, and later for neighbors in need. Nana would remind me, "When you knit for others, Margaret, you are giving warmth that is more than physical. You are giving thought, love, and time." I learned that effort invested in others carries meaning far beyond the object itself. Each loop became a thread of connection, a gesture of care that could be felt and remembered. Mistakes were inevitable, but they became lessons rather than failures. A dropped stitch or a misaligned row required attention and patience to correct. I learned humility in these moments, understanding that even small errors can teach important truths about diligence, observation, and adaptation. Over time, I began to appreciate that imperfection is part of the process, that mistakes are not shameful but essential to growth. Knitting also strengthened my confidence. The first time I completed an entire scarf without assistance, I held it up with pride, feeling the weight of accomplishment in my hands. Nana clapped her hands softly, smiling. "See, Margaret? You have learned not just a skill, but the patience and persistence to see a project through." I realized that success is often built from small, consistent steps, and that patience and focus are just as important as talent or speed. Even decades later, I still knit, though now my hands are slower, my eyes more careful. Each piece I create carries the lessons of that first lesson with Nana: patience, focus, perseverance, creativity, humility, and the joy of giving. Knitting became more than a hobby. It became a symbol of how careful effort, applied steadily, produces results that endure. It taught me that small acts, repeated with intention, can create beauty, warmth, and connection that lasts a lifetime. Nana's knitting lessons shaped not only my skill with yarn and needles, but also my approach to life. They taught me that careful attention, patience, and persistence are qualities that apply to every challenge, relationship, and endeavor. Each stitch I make reminds me of her guidance, her steady hands, and her belief in the value of time, effort, and love. Knitting was, and remains, a lifelong teacher, one whose lessons are woven into the fabric of my character. I still remember the day I read a full book alone for the very first time, and how it opened my mind in ways I had never imagined. I was 11 years old, and it was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the world outside is gray and quiet, and the only sound is the soft patter of droplets against the window pane. My grandmother, my Nana, had given me a worn copy of Little Women, its spine creased from years of loving use. She said, "Margaret, read this carefully. Stories hold wisdom and adventure, and one day, they will teach you more than I ever could with words alone." I took the book in my hands, feeling both nervous and excited. At first, the words seemed overwhelming. The pages were filled with sentences longer than I was used to, ideas I had never encountered, and characters whose lives were far removed from my own. I struggled to understand some passages, rereading them several times, sometimes whispering the words aloud. Nana watched quietly, offering only gentle encouragement. "Patience, Margaret," she said. "Let the story unfold. You will catch the meaning in time." I took a deep breath and began, determined to follow the journey from start to finish. As I read, I felt transported. I could see the March family in my mind, their home filled with warmth and laughter, the struggles they faced, and the love they shared. I laughed when the sisters argued, felt sadness when they experienced loss, and admired their courage in moments of challenge. I realized that the story was more than just words. It was a world, a series of lessons and emotions captured on paper, waiting for me to discover. I was no longer just a girl in a small stone cottage. I was an observer, a participant, and sometimes even a confidant to the characters. Finishing that book alone was a revelation. I understood for the first time the power of imagination and the importance of self-guided exploration. Reading was not just an exercise in learning words. It was a way to think, to empathize, and to see life from perspectives far beyond my own experience. I discovered that stories could teach me about human nature, about kindness, bravery, and resilience, and that by understanding characters' choices and struggles, I could learn lessons that applied to my own life. The book also taught me patience and discipline. I had to sit for long stretches, concentrating on the story, slowing my reading to savor the details, and occasionally struggling to finish chapters when my mind wandered. But each paragraph I read strengthened my focus, training me to engage fully with a text and to think critically about what I was reading. I learned that understanding and growth often come from persistence, from giving something your attention even when it is challenging. I was also surprised by the emotions I felt. When I closed the book at the end, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and longing, a yearning to continue in a world that no longer existed beyond the pages. That longing taught me the enduring impact of stories. They could stay with you, influence your thoughts, and shape your imagination long after the book was closed. I realized that reading was not a solitary activity, but a bridge between minds, across time and space, connecting me to experiences and wisdom that were not my own. From that day forward, reading became a refuge, a way to explore worlds, ideas, and possibilities beyond the confines of my home and village. I devoured one book after another, each teaching me something new about people, values, courage, and the complexity of life. Reading fostered empathy in me, allowing me to understand people whose lives and choices were different from my own. It strengthened my mind, expanded my vocabulary, and gave me a sense of independence, knowing that through books I could explore, learn, and grow on my own. Nana's gift of that first book also taught me about trust and guidance. She had given me the book, not because she expected me to understand everything immediately, but because she trusted that I could discover the lessons within it. She understood that wisdom often comes through exploration and experience, not through instruction alone. I learned to trust my own judgment, to ask questions, and to seek understanding for myself. That lesson has guided me in countless areas of life ever since, from learning new skills to raising my own children and grandchildren. Reading that first full book alone also showed me the joy of accomplishment. Finishing the last page gave me a quiet pride that was different from the fleeting pleasure of a game or a treat. It was a pride built on effort, focus, and curiosity. I had set out on a journey, navigated its challenges, and emerged changed, richer in understanding and perspective. I realized that this sense of achievement, found in quiet perseverance, is one of life's most enduring rewards. Even now, decades later, I can recall that rainy afternoon, the smell of old paper, the soft sound of raindrops against the window, and the feeling of being utterly absorbed in a story. That first experience of reading alone shaped my lifelong love of books and learning. It taught me that imagination has power, that knowledge is built one page at a time, and that the quiet pursuit of understanding can be as thrilling and transformative as any adventure in the real world. I remember the first time I helped Nana in the garden, a small patch of earth behind our stone cottage that she tended with unwavering care. I was 12, and spring had just begun to awaken the world around us. The soil was soft and damp from recent rains, the air smelled sweet with fresh growth, and tiny green shoots were peeking up through the dark earth, tentative but determined. Nana motioned for me to follow her, her hands already caked with soil, her fingers nimble and sure. "Margaret," she said, smiling, "gardening teaches patience, care, and the quiet joy of nurturing life. Today, you will learn more than just planting seeds." At first I was clumsy. My small hands struggled to dig furrows deep enough for the seeds, and I planted some too close together or too shallowly. Nana knelt beside me, guiding my hands, showing me how to press the soil gently over the tiny seeds so that they would be protected but still able to grow. "The soil must cradle them, Margaret, not crush them," she explained. I began to understand that gardening was not a task to be rushed. It required attention, tenderness, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. We planted rows of vegetables first: lettuce, radishes, and peas, tiny things that seemed fragile in my hands. Nana explained that each plant has its own rhythm, its own needs, and its own pace. "You cannot hurry growth, child," she said. "Nature will teach you if you watch and listen." I spent hours kneeling beside her, observing the soil, the seeds, and the emerging sprouts. I learned to notice the subtle differences in color, the tilt of a leaf toward the sun, the way moisture absorbed into the ground. These details, I realized, mattered more than speed or efficiency. They were the language of the garden itself. Watering the plants was a lesson in balance. Too much could drown the seedlings. Too little could dry them out. Nana taught me to feel the soil with my fingers, to sense when it was ready for water and when it could wait. I discovered that gardening demands mindfulness, an attentiveness that goes beyond mechanical actions, to understanding the life you are nurturing. Each droplet I poured became an act of care, a quiet promise to support growth and sustain life. We also tended flowers, marigolds, daisies, and tulips, that Nana loved for their beauty and fragrance. She explained that beauty is not trivial. It nourishes the spirit and reminds us that life is not only about survival but also about joy. I learned to prune dead leaves, to support bending stems, and to arrange plants in ways that honored both their natural tendencies and the aesthetics of the garden. Gardening became a meditation, a quiet practice in observation, patience, and intentional care. Weeding was less glamorous, but Nana taught me that it was just as important as planting. Removing weeds prevented them from stealing nutrients from the plants we nurtured. At first, I resented it, seeing it as a tedious chore, but Nana's words changed my perspective. "Margaret, life is often like a garden," she said. "You must clear away what hinders growth, even if it is unpleasant, to make space for what truly matters." I realized then that patience and effort, even in tasks that seem small or unpleasant, are essential for long-term success and well-being. Throughout the days we spent together in the garden, Nana shared stories of her own childhood, how she had learned to care for plants, animals, and people alike. She spoke of the importance of nurturing not just life, but relationships, of observing patiently, and of giving time and attention generously. I began to see parallels between tending the garden and living a good life. Both require care, attentiveness, patience, and understanding. Both reward consistency and compassion. By summer, the garden flourished. The vegetables grew plump and green. The flowers bloomed in brilliant colors, and the air was filled with fragrance and the hum of bees. I felt pride and accomplishment in every row we had planted and nurtured. I understood more deeply than I had before that effort invested in growth, whether in soil, in skills, or in people, yields rewards over time. The harvest was not immediate. It required patience and dedication, but the fruits, when they arrived, were richer for the care that had preceded them. Even the small failures carried lessons. Some seeds did not sprout, some plants wilted despite our care. Nana taught me not to be discouraged, but to observe, learn, and try again. She said, "Margaret, not everything you plant will flourish, but every effort teaches you something. Growth is not guaranteed, but dedication creates opportunity." I realized then that resilience, the ability to continue nurturing despite setbacks, is one of the most valuable lessons a garden can teach. Now, decades later, I still tend to gardens, whether small pots on my windowsill or larger plots in the yard. Each time I plant a seed, water a sprout, or prune a flower, I feel Nana's guidance in my hands and heart. Gardening taught me lessons that go beyond soil and seeds. It taught me focus, patience, nurturing, resilience, and joy in small, consistent acts of care. It shaped how I approach family, work, and life itself, reminding me that with attention, kindness, and patience, growth is possible in every area of life. Even today, when I see a seedling breaking through the soil, I smile and remember that first spring with Nana. The garden was more than a patch of earth. It was a classroom, a place where I learned that care and patience can transform small beginnings into something beautiful and enduring. The lessons of that garden, nurturing, observation, patience, and resilience, remain with me, guiding me in everything I do, every day of my life. I remember the first time I baked bread with Nana, and how the simple act of kneading dough became one of the most enduring lessons of my childhood. I was 12, and the kitchen smelled faintly of flour and warmth, the hearth fire glowing gently in the corner. Nana had a large wooden bowl ready, along with a sack of flour, a small jar of yeast, salt, and water. She motioned me to stand beside her, her hands already dusted with flour. "Margaret," she said, smiling, "baking bread teaches patience, diligence, and the reward of careful effort. Today, you will learn more than cooking. You will learn how effort turns into sustenance and joy." At first, the task felt overwhelming. The flour seemed endless, the dough sticky and stubborn, and my small hands struggled to knead it evenly. Nana guided me, demonstrating the motion, pressing with the heels of my hands, folding, turning, and pressing again. "Work it gently, Margaret," she said. "The dough responds to care, just as people respond to patience and attention." I realized immediately that baking was not about rushing. It was about rhythm, persistence, and respect for the process. As I kneaded, I began to feel the dough change under my hands. What had been sticky and shapeless slowly became smooth, elastic, and pliable. I learned that transformation takes time, that effort invested carefully and consistently produces results that cannot be hurried. Nana explained that bread, like life, cannot be forced. It must be nurtured, watched over, and guided with care. Every fold and press was a lesson in diligence, a reminder that work done with attention and love yields lasting rewards. Nana also taught me the importance of precision. Too much flour could make the bread dense. Too little yeast would prevent it from rising. Each measurement mattered. Each step required thought and care. I realized that success often comes from paying attention to details, from understanding that small actions have significant consequences. The discipline required in baking bread mirrored lessons I was learning in other areas of life. Patience, observation, and steady effort are more valuable than haste or shortcuts. The waiting period, while the dough rose, was another lesson. I watched as it expanded slowly, filling the bowl, and learned that some results cannot be rushed. Nana explained that the yeast needed time to work, that the warmth of the kitchen encouraged growth, and that trying to speed the process would ruin the bread. I understood then that patience is an active process. It requires mindfulness, care, and trust that effort applied consistently will bear fruit. When the dough was finally ready to bake, Nana showed me how to shape it, score the top, and place it carefully in the oven. I felt a mix of pride and nervousness as I slid the loaves onto the hot stone. The kitchen filled with the rich, comforting aroma of baking bread, a smell that seemed to wrap itself around me like a warm hug. I watched in awe as the loaves rose further, browned evenly, and emerged golden and fragrant. The sense of accomplishment was profound, not just because I had made bread, but because I had participated in a process that required diligence, patience, and care. Baking bread with Nana taught me about reward and satisfaction. The effort invested, the kneading, the measuring, the careful watching, culminated in something tangible and nourishing. I understood that many of life's most meaningful achievements come not from instant results, but from steady, consistent effort applied with care. I learned that the work itself can be satisfying, and that the reward, whether bread, knowledge, or a strengthened character, is made sweeter by the effort required to achieve it. I also learned the joy of sharing the results of our labor. That first loaf was placed carefully on the table, and my family gathered to break it together. The crust was crisp, the interior soft, and every bite carried the warmth of our shared effort. Nana smiled as we ate, and I realized that creating something for others adds meaning beyond the work itself. Bread became a symbol of connection, of generosity, and of care. It reminded me that what we give, created with intention and effort, nourishes more than the body. It nourishes the heart. Mistakes were inevitable. My first attempts at shaping the loaves were uneven. One loaf cracked along the side, another was slightly dense, but Nana taught me not to be discouraged. "Every mistake teaches you something, Margaret," she said. "You will do better next time if you remember the lesson." I learned resilience in the kitchen, the ability to try again, and the understanding that errors are part of learning, not reasons for shame. Each failure became a step toward mastery, each loaf a testament to growth and perseverance. Even decades later, whenever I bake bread, I feel Nana's presence beside me, the way she guided my hands, the calm encouragement in her voice, and the lessons embedded in every step of the process. Baking bread taught me more than cooking. It taught me diligence, patience, care, resilience, and the profound joy of creating something that nourishes others. Each loaf is a reminder that thoughtful effort produces lasting reward, and that the process of creation, slow, careful, and intentional, is as valuable as the outcome. Baking bread with Nana shaped my understanding of work, responsibility, and care. It reinforced that effort, applied steadily and thoughtfully, yields tangible results, that patience is essential, and that sharing the fruits of labor enriches both giver and receiver. The lessons of the kitchen became lessons for life, guiding me in family, work, and every endeavor where dedication and care matter. I remember the first time I learned to play the piano, a polished mahogany instrument that sat in the corner of our parlor, its keys gleaming under the sunlight that streamed through the window. I was 12, and Nana had decided that it was time I learned an instrument, not merely for entertainment, but for the lessons it could teach about discipline, creativity, and the beauty of expression. She seated me on the bench and placed my small hands on the ivory keys. "Margaret," she said gently, "music teaches patience, attention, and the courage to create. Today you will learn more than notes. You will discover how practice shapes skill and character." At first it was frustrating. My fingers fumbled over the keys, pressing the wrong notes, hesitating, or striking two keys at once. The sound was harsh, uneven, and far from the melodies I imagined in my head. Nana did not scold me. Instead, she guided my fingers with patience, showing me the correct placement and encouraging me to focus on each note. "Do not rush," she said. "Each key is a step, Margaret, and every step matters. Listen carefully, and you will hear the music unfold." The lessons began with simple scales and exercises. I had to repeat them over and over, slowly and deliberately. I grew frustrated at first, wishing to play songs immediately, to hear the music I loved. But Nana explained that mastery requires patience and repetition, and that each small exercise built the foundation for larger, more complex compositions. I realized that discipline, often tedious, was essential to growth, whether in music, learning, or life itself. As I practiced daily, I began to notice progress. My fingers became more agile, my hands learned to coordinate, and my ears began to detect subtle differences in tone and rhythm. I discovered that effort invested consistently yields results, and that even small incremental improvements are meaningful. Nana reminded me frequently that success is a journey, not a destination, and that dedication to the process is more valuable than the immediate reward. Playing the piano also taught me creativity. Once I had mastered the basics, Nana encouraged me to experiment, combining notes in new ways, improvising melodies, and expressing my emotions through music. I realized that structure and discipline are not constraints, but tools for creativity. The rules of music provided a framework within which I could explore, innovate, and express myself. I learned that creativity, like life, thrives when guided by understanding and supported by practice. Mistakes were inevitable, and I learned to embrace them as part of the process. Hitting the wrong note or missing a rhythm initially frustrated me, but Nana taught me to listen, correct, and try again. "Every error is a lesson, Margaret," she said. "Do not fear it. Learn from it, and your music will grow stronger." I began to understand that perseverance is a critical element of learning, that resilience transforms failure into growth, and that patience with oneself is as important as discipline with the hands. Beyond skill, the piano taught me focus and mindfulness. Playing required full attention, counting beats, watching my fingers, listening to the sound, and anticipating what came next. I discovered a quiet joy in immersion, a meditative state where the world outside faded, leaving only the connection between thought, emotion, and expression. Music became a way to center myself, to channel energy into something beautiful, and to understand that concentration and presence are vital for success in any endeavor. I also learned humility and respect. The piano could not be rushed or forced. It demanded time, attention, and care. Some days, my progress seemed slow, and I felt impatient. But with Nana's guidance, I understood that mastery is gradual, that patience is rewarded, and that respect for the instrument and for the process creates lasting skill and fulfillment. Music taught me that effort, applied steadily and respectfully, is a path to excellence. Sharing music with others was another lesson. I played for my family, feeling their delight and encouragement, and I realized that creative expression is most meaningful when it touches others. The piano became not just a tool for personal growth, but a bridge for connection, a way to communicate emotions that words alone could not convey. I learned that dedication to craft carries value beyond oneself, enriching the lives of others through effort and expression. Even decades later, when I sit at a piano, I feel the same excitement and focus that I did on that first day. The lessons I learned extend beyond music. Discipline, patience, creativity, perseverance, focus, humility, and empathy. The piano taught me that sustained effort, combined with care and attention, produces beauty, mastery, and connection. It reminded me that learning is a journey, not a race, and that even small, consistent practice transforms skill, character, and perspective. Nana's guidance during those early piano lessons shaped not only my ability to play, but also my approach to challenges, learning, and life itself. I discovered the value of patience, the power of consistent effort, and the joy of expressing oneself fully and authentically. Music became a lifelong companion, a teacher, and a reminder that creativity, nurtured with discipline and care, enriches every corner of life. I remember the first time I cared for a sick neighbor, a moment that taught me more about empathy and compassion than any lesson I had learned in books or school. I was 13, and Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow who lived a few cottages down the lane, had fallen ill with a high fever that left her weak and bedridden. Nana called me over one morning, her eyes calm but serious, and said, "Margaret, it is time you learn that caring for others is as important as caring for yourself. Compassion is a skill, a gift, and a responsibility. Today you will help Mrs. Thompson, and I will guide you." At first, I felt nervous. I had never been alone in tending to someone so fragile, and I worried I might do something wrong. Nana showed me how to prepare a simple broth, how to clean her room, and how to adjust her blanket so she would be comfortable. "Notice her needs, Margaret," Nana whispered. "Listen more than you speak. Sometimes, simply being present is the greatest gift you can give." I followed her instructions carefully, each small act filling me with a sense of purpose and, unexpectedly, humility. When I entered Mrs. Thompson's cottage, the smell of sickness mixed with the faint aroma of lavender that she always loved. She smiled weakly at me, a gesture that carried warmth despite her discomfort. "Thank you for coming, Margaret," she murmured. Her gratitude made me realize that even small gestures, pouring water, fluffing pillows, offering food, carry weight and meaning. Caring for her was not about heroic actions, but about consistent, attentive presence, noticing details others might overlook, and responding with kindness. I began by offering the broth Nana had prepared. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she held the cup, and I had to steady it gently, guiding her with patience. I realized that care often requires attentiveness, sensitivity, and a willingness to slow down. Every movement mattered, every word needed to be chosen thoughtfully, and every glance had the power to comfort. I learned that empathy is not just an emotion. It is an active practice, a deliberate attention to the needs of another person. As the day continued, I noticed that simply sitting with her, holding her hand, and listening to her stories seemed to lift her spirits. Mrs. Thompson spoke of her childhood, her late husband, and her grandchildren. She shared memories that made her eyes sparkle despite her weakness. I learned then that compassion includes listening, validating, and sharing presence without judgment. It is not always about solving problems, but about acknowledging another's humanity and offering comfort through attentiveness and care. I also learned patience in caring. Mrs. Thompson's progress was slow. The fever fluctuated and her appetite came and went. There were moments when my effort seemed insignificant, and I felt frustrated. Nana reminded me, "Healing is a process, Margaret. Patience is a gift you give not only to others, but to yourself as well." I began to understand that true compassion requires endurance, a steady commitment even when results are not immediate, and that the act of caring itself is valuable, regardless of visible outcomes. Through this experience, I discovered the importance of humility. I could not make her well instantly, nor could I replace the comfort of a loving family. But my presence, my attentiveness, and my small acts of service mattered. I realized that empathy is grounded in recognizing our limitations while still offering what we can, no matter how modest. The simplest gestures, adjusting a blanket, listening to a story, bringing a cup of tea, can carry profound significance when performed with genuine care. I also learned responsibility. Caring for Mrs. Thompson required vigilance, awareness, and the ability to anticipate needs. I checked her temperature, monitored her condition, and made sure she had everything she required. I learned that compassion is not passive. It demands action, observation, and initiative. It requires being present mentally and physically, ready to respond thoughtfully to the changing needs of another person. By the end of the day, Mrs. Thompson had managed to sip the broth and rest more comfortably. She smiled at me and whispered, "You have a kind heart, Margaret. Thank you for being here." Her words touched me deeply. I realized that compassion is reciprocal. It enriches both the giver and the receiver. My own heart felt fuller, my perspective broader, and my understanding of human connection deeper. I had discovered that empathy is a practice that transforms those who engage in it, shaping character and guiding future actions. Even now, decades later, I recall that day vividly. The lessons I learned caring for Mrs. Thompson have stayed with me. Empathy requires attentiveness, patience, humility, and action. Compassion is strengthened through practice, and even the smallest acts of kindness carry profound significance. That day shaped the way I approach family, neighbors, and strangers alike. It taught me that life is richer when we extend ourselves to others, that caring is an essential part of being human, and that compassion, when practiced consistently, nurtures connection and understanding across generations. Caring for a sick neighbor taught me that the heart grows through service, that the smallest gestures can leave lasting impressions, and that empathy is not a passive feeling but an active commitment. It instilled in me the belief that attention, patience, and love are more powerful than any material gift. That first day of service became a cornerstone in my understanding of life, shaping the values I carried into adulthood and the compassion I continue to offer even now. I remember the first time I sewed clothes for my family, a task that seemed daunting yet exciting, and one that taught me lessons in creativity, patience, and pride in work. I was 13, and Nana had brought out her old sewing machine, a sturdy contraption of polished wood and iron, alongside baskets of fabric, spools of thread, and an assortment of needles and pins. She looked at me with a mixture of warmth and seriousness. "Margaret," she said, "sewing is not just about making clothes. It teaches you care, precision, creativity, and the joy of creating something with your own hands. Today, you will begin." At first, the machine intimidated me. Its foot pedal felt heavy, and the thread kept tangling, slipping through my fingers or breaking unexpectedly. Nana guided my hands gently, showing me how to thread the needle, adjust the tension, and guide the fabric steadily under the moving needle. "Patience, Margaret," she said. "The cloth will follow your hands if you move with care. Do not rush and do not force it." I quickly learned that sewing demanded attention, patience, and the willingness to start over when mistakes occurred. My first project was a simple apron for my mother. I measured the fabric carefully, marked the lines with chalk, and began to sew. The stitches were uneven at first, and I often had to stop to correct errors. But Nana reminded me that diligence matters more than speed. "Each stitch counts, Margaret," she said. "Your care is visible in the work, and that is what gives it value." Slowly, the pieces began to take shape. I felt a growing sense of satisfaction as I watched the fabric transform from a flat, shapeless rectangle into something purposeful, functional, and beautiful. Sewing taught me precision. Every measurement, every cut, and every stitch affected the final outcome. I learned to observe carefully, to plan ahead, and to adjust when necessary. I realized that attention to detail is a form of respect for the materials, for the person who will wear the clothing, and for the work itself. The effort I invested became visible in the quality of the finished apron, and I felt a pride that went beyond accomplishment. It was a pride rooted in care, focus, and creativity. Creativity was another lesson. Nana encouraged me to choose patterns, mix fabrics, and add decorative touches like lace or embroidery. I experimented with colors and textures, learning to combine practicality with beauty. Sewing became more than a task. It became a way to express myself, to make something unique for the people I loved. I discovered that creativity is strengthened by discipline, that rules and techniques provide a foundation upon which imagination can flourish. Patience was perhaps the hardest lesson. Sewing required slow, deliberate movements, repeated actions, and careful attention. Mistakes were inevitable, uneven seams, tangled threads, or misaligned pieces, but each one offered an opportunity to learn. Nana would gently guide me through corrections, reminding me that perseverance is part of mastery. I realized that patience is not passive, it is active, requiring focus, resilience, and the willingness to continue even when progress feels slow. The process also taught me the value of care for others. Each stitch in the apron was a gesture of thoughtfulness, a way to honor my mother and provide something she could use and enjoy. I realized that work created with intention and love carries meaning beyond its practical function. Sewing became a form of service, a way to nurture family through effort, skill, and attention. It taught me that giving is most meaningful when it is personal, when it involves time, thought, and care. By the time the apron was complete, I felt a sense of accomplishment unlike any I had experienced before. Nana smiled and nodded, her eyes reflecting pride and encouragement. "See, Margaret? You have learned more than sewing. You have learned patience, creativity, and pride in work. Remember these lessons. They will guide you in everything you do." I understood that the lessons embedded in sewing extended far beyond the fabric. They were lessons about diligence, persistence, care, and the joy of creating something meaningful. Even decades later, I still sew, though now my hands move slower and more carefully. Each piece I create carries the lessons of that first project with Nana. The importance of patience, precision, creativity, and care for others. Sewing taught me that work done with intention is a form of love, that mastery grows from persistence, and that the act of creation is a source of pride and fulfillment. It shaped the way I approach family, work, and life, reminding me that the effort we invest in meaningful tasks enriches both ourselves and those around us. Sewing also taught me humility. Not every project was perfect, and not every stitch aligned flawlessly. But the imperfections became part of the learning, a reminder that growth and skill develop over time. I learned to appreciate effort, resilience, and persistence, understanding that the value of work lies not only in perfection, but in care, attention, and intention. That first experience sewing clothes with Nana became a cornerstone in my life. It reinforced the belief that patience, creativity, care, and persistence are essential qualities, not only in making fabric into garments, but in shaping character, nurturing relationships, and building a meaningful life. Even today, as I handle a needle and thread, I feel her guidance in my hands, her lessons in my mind, and the enduring joy of creating something beautiful and useful with love. I remember the first time I learned to ride a bicycle, a moment that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, and taught me lessons in courage, balance, and resilience. I was 14, and the old bicycle had been stored in the barn for months, its paint faded, the chain a little rusty, but still sturdy enough for practice. Nana had encouraged me, her eyes bright with reassurance, yet she knew this was a challenge I had to face with my own determination. "Margaret," she said, "riding a bicycle teaches you courage, balance, and the importance of getting back up when you fall. Today, you will learn more than cycling. You will learn about life." At first, I was hesitant. The bicycle seemed impossibly large, its handlebars awkward in my small hands, the seat high and unfamiliar. Nana adjusted the seat and held the bike steady, her hands firm yet gentle. "You can do this," she said. "Trust yourself, trust the bike, and remember that falling is part of learning." I nodded, though my heart pounded with nervous excitement. Stepping onto the pedals for the first time, I felt unsteady, unsure, and overwhelmed by the thought of moving forward without falling. The first few attempts were awkward. I wobbled, the bicycle leaning dangerously to one side, and my feet scrabbled for balance. Nana ran alongside me, holding the seat, giving guidance and offering encouragement. "Keep your eyes forward, Margaret, not on the pedals," she said. "Balance comes from focus and confidence. Trust yourself." Her words helped, though I still trembled with every pedal push, my muscles tense, ready to bail out at the slightest wobble. I fell, more than once. I scraped my knees, bruised my elbows, and felt frustration rise in my chest. But each time, Nana helped me stand, dusted me off, and reminded me, Every fall teaches you something. Courage is not the absence of fear, Margaret, but the determination to try again despite it. I realized that resilience is not abstract. It is a practice, something we build through repeated attempts, through facing discomfort, and through choosing to continue even when progress is painful or slow. Slowly, I began to find a rhythm. The bicycle responded to my balance. My feet pressed the pedals in coordination, and I could feel the subtle shifts that kept me upright. Nana let go for a few seconds, then for longer stretches, always watching but allowing me the independence to discover control on my own. I discovered that confidence grows from experience, from testing limits, and from learning to trust both yourself and the tools you use. Each small success fueled courage, and each wobble taught me to adjust, correct, and persist. Learning to ride a bicycle also taught me patience. Mastery was not instant. It came in small increments. I celebrated tiny victories. The first time I stayed upright for a few seconds without help. The first short ride down the lane. The first time I navigated a gentle curve. I understood that progress often comes gradually, and that patience is essential when learning any skill. Rushing, I learned, only led to falls and frustration, while steady effort yielded confidence and competence. Balance, both physical and mental, became a key lesson. I learned to anticipate shifts, to keep my center steady, and to respond calmly to instability. But I also realized that life requires similar balance, managing fear and courage, persistence and patience, effort and rest. Riding the bicycle became a metaphor for navigating challenges, reminding me that equilibrium is maintained through attention, adaptation, and self-awareness. By the end of that first day, I was able to ride for longer stretches, my heart soaring with exhilaration and pride. I had faced fear, embraced discomfort, and discovered that persistence leads to growth. Nana's encouragement and guidance were vital, but the achievement was mine, earned through effort, resilience, and determination. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that courage is something cultivated through action, not simply imagined. Even decades later, when I see a bicycle, I am reminded of those early lessons in courage, balance, and resilience. That first ride shaped my approach to challenges in life. To confront fears head-on, to persevere despite setbacks, and to celebrate every small victory along the way. It taught me that falling is not failure, but an opportunity to learn, adjust, and rise stronger. The experience also reminded me of the importance of support and guidance. Nana's steady presence, encouragement, and wisdom made all the difference, showing me how mentorship and care can empower someone to overcome fear. Learning to ride a bicycle was more than mastering a skill. It was a lesson in character, patience, and determination. I learned that growth often comes through discomfort, that courage is built through repeated effort, and that resilience is strengthened by getting back up after every fall. The experience instilled confidence, independence, and a belief in my own capabilities, shaping the way I approached every challenge that followed. That day, I discovered the joy of freedom and accomplishment, the thrill of movement and balance, and the satisfaction of effort rewarded with success. I learned that courage is nurtured through practice, that resilience is cultivated through persistence, and that balance, both on a bicycle and in life, requires focus, adaptability, and trust in oneself. Even now, I carry those lessons with me, riding the waves of life with patience, determination, and quiet courage. I remember the first time I attended the village fair, a day that opened my eyes to observation, curiosity, and the joy of community. I was 14, and the fair was held in the center of the village, a lively place filled with colorful tents, the scent of fresh pastries, and the sounds of laughter, music, and the chatter of families. Nana took my hand and led me through the crowd, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Margaret," she said, "the world is full of lessons if you know how to look and listen. Today, you will learn by observing, asking questions, and being curious about everything around you. At first, the fair overwhelmed me. There were so many people, so many colors, so many smells and sounds all at once. Children ran past me with painted faces, merchants shouted about their wares, and musicians played lively tunes that made my heart leap. Nana's calm presence reminded me to slow down, take in each detail, and notice things that others might overlook. She encouraged me to watch carefully, to pay attention to the expressions on people's faces, the movement of the animals, and the rhythm of the crowd. I started with the market stalls, curious about the fruits, vegetables, and handmade goods on display. I watched the merchants skillfully arranging their produce, calling out to attract customers, and negotiating with buyers. Nana explained that observation teaches understanding, that by watching carefully, you can learn how people think, what they value, and how they interact with one another. I realized that being curious and attentive allows you to understand the world without judgment, and that learning often begins with simply paying attention. Next, we visited the animal pens. Chickens clucked, goats bleated, and horses stamped impatiently as their owners prepared them for competitions. I was fascinated by the care taken to feed, groom, and prepare the animals, and Nana encouraged me to ask questions. "Curiosity, Margaret, is the key to learning," she said. "Never be afraid to ask why or how. Every question opens a door." I asked about feeding schedules, breeds, and training methods, and the owners explained patiently. I learned that curiosity is not just a desire for knowledge, it is a tool for understanding, empathy, and engagement with the world. I also watched the performers, jugglers and musicians, marveling at their skill and dedication. Nana pointed out the hours of practice behind every flawless trick or tune. She said, "Observe, Margaret. Skill is often invisible, hidden behind what seems effortless. Respect the effort behind the performance." I realized that observation teaches appreciation, that understanding the effort and intention behind people's actions fosters empathy and respect. I began to notice small details, the way a musician's fingers moved over strings, the careful stance of a juggler, the way children watched with wide-eyed admiration. The fair was also a lesson in community. Families gathered together, neighbors greeted one another warmly, and strangers offered help or shared smiles. I noticed how people supported each other, celebrated achievements, and shared in the simple joys of the day. Nana whispered, "Community is built on attention, kindness, and participation. By noticing and engaging with others, you become part of something larger than yourself." I understood that being present and observant in social settings allows you to connect meaningfully, to contribute, and to learn from the experiences of others. As the day went on, Nana encouraged me to try new things. I tasted unfamiliar foods, examined handmade crafts, and even watched a puppet show. She taught me that curiosity often leads to growth, that exploring beyond what is familiar expands understanding and joy. I discovered that stepping outside my comfort zone, asking questions, and paying attention to details enriches both knowledge and experience. Every new sight, sound, and interaction became a lesson in engagement with the world. By the afternoon, the fair had taken on a rhythm of its own. People moved in waves, sounds blended into music, and colors danced in my eyes. I realized that observation is not passive. It requires mindfulness, attention, and an openness to learning from everything around you. I began to see connections between people, patterns in the marketplace, and stories in the expressions of performers and attendees. Nana's words rang true. The world reveals its lessons to those who look carefully and approach it with curiosity. When we left the fair, I felt a sense of wonder, appreciation, and understanding I had not known before. The day had been more than entertainment. It had been a lesson in observation, curiosity, and community. I learned that paying attention allows you to understand people and places deeply, that asking questions opens doors to new knowledge, and that engaging with the world with openness creates connection and growth. Even decades later, when I think of village fairs, I remember that first experience vividly. The vibrant colors, the lively sounds, the warmth of community, and Nana's gentle guidance. The lessons of observation, curiosity, and attentiveness have shaped the way I approach life, teaching me to notice details, ask questions, and engage fully with the people and world around me. The fair became a metaphor for life itself, full of complexity, beauty, and opportunities to learn. If only we take the time to look, listen, and participate. That first fair was a turning point, a day when I realized that the world is full of lessons, waiting for those willing to notice, to question, and to connect. It taught me that curiosity is a bridge to understanding, observation is a tool for learning, and community is strengthened when we pay attention to one another. The joy and wisdom I gained that day continue to guide me, reminding me to approach life with open eyes, a curious mind, and a heart attentive to the lives around me. I remember the first time I planted a tree, a moment that felt simple at the time but grew into a lesson about legacy, patience, and nurturing the future. I was 15, and my father had brought home a young sapling wrapped in burlap. Its roots were damp with soil, and its slender trunk seemed fragile, as if one strong wind might snap it in two. He carried it into the yard and set it down gently, as though it were something precious. Then he called me over. "Margaret," he said, "this tree will outlive both of us. Today you will plant it, and one day you will look back and understand what it means to leave something behind." I was curious, but also a little nervous. I had never planted anything larger than a row of beans in the garden. My father handed me a spade and showed me where to dig, a patch of earth near the edge of the field, where the sunlight lingered longest. At first, the soil resisted, hard and stubborn under my spade, but as I dug deeper, it softened, revealing dark, rich earth. My hands grew blistered, my back ached, but I felt a sense of responsibility in creating a place where the young tree might take root. When the hole was deep enough, we lowered the sapling carefully into it, straightening its trunk so it stood upright. My father taught me how to spread the roots gently, making sure they had room to grow. Then we covered them with soil, patting it down firmly but not too tightly, leaving space for air and water. He said, "Roots are like children, Margaret. They need protection, but they also need freedom to grow strong." I thought about those words for a long time afterward, realizing that nurturing requires both care and trust. As I poured water around the base of the tree, watching the earth drink it in, I felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. I had helped create a beginning, yet I knew the tree's growth was beyond my control. It would need rain, sunshine, and years of time, things I could not provide on my own. Patience was the greatest lesson that day. My father explained, "You may not see this tree reach its full height, but you will know that you gave it a chance. Some things we begin are not for us, but for those who come after us." That idea took root in me as firmly as the sapling itself. In the weeks and months that followed, I checked on the tree daily. I watched for signs of new leaves, worried over storms that shook its young branches, and made sure it had enough water in dry spells. Each small change, tiny buds, fresh shoots, stronger bark, felt like a reward, proof that care and patience bore fruit. I learned that nurturing is not a one-time act, but an ongoing responsibility, requiring consistency, attention, and faith in the unseen work happening beneath the surface. The tree also taught me about resilience. Despite winds that bent its young branches and rains that battered its leaves, it kept growing, quietly and steadily. I realized that growth is often invisible, taking place slowly and without fanfare, yet it continues as long as the roots are secure. That truth stayed with me through many seasons of my life, reminding me to trust the process, even when results are not immediate. Years later, the sapling grew into a strong tree, its branches wide enough to cast shade in summer, and its roots deep enough to hold steady through storms. Children played beneath it, birds nested in its branches, and in time, it became part of the landscape, as if it had always been there. Each time I saw it, I remembered the day I planted it and the lessons it taught me: patience, care, and the importance of leaving behind something that would serve others. Even now, as I sit and recall those days, I think about the meaning of legacy. That tree is still standing long after my father has gone. It is a living memory of his wisdom, my effort, and the passage of time. Planting it showed me that our lives are not only about what we accomplish for ourselves, but also about what we give to the future. Acts of kindness, traditions, lessons, and even something as simple as a tree, which can offer shade, fruit, or beauty long after we are gone. I also think about how planting that tree shaped the way I approached my own family. Raising children felt very much like tending a young sapling, guiding, protecting, nourishing, and then stepping back to allow growth. There were times I wanted to shield them from every storm, but I remembered my father's words about roots needing both safety and freedom. Just like that tree, they needed space to grow strong in their own way. Looking back, I realized that the act of planting was symbolic. It was about more than putting roots into the ground. It was about putting hope into the future, about believing that something begun today could flourish long after tomorrow. It was about trust in time, in nature, and in the quiet resilience of life itself. That first tree I planted became a teacher, silent yet profound. It showed me that patience yields beauty, that nurturing requires persistence, and that leaving a legacy is one of the greatest gifts we can offer. Even now, whenever I see young trees being planted, I smile and remember my own sapling, the lessons it taught me, and the way it rooted me in values of care, patience, and hope for the generations yet to come. I remember the first time I stayed up all night to watch a snowfall, a moment that taught me lessons in wonder, patience, and the quiet beauty of life. I was 15, and the village had been blanketed in white, a soft hush settling over rooftops, fields, and trees. The wind whispered through the branches, and the world seemed both infinite and intimate at once. Nana had nudged me awake that evening, her eyes bright in the lamplight. "Margaret," she said, "tonight you will learn the magic of stillness. Some things are meant to be watched, not hurried. Some beauty reveals itself only to those who wait." At first I thought it would be boring. Sitting quietly through the night, watching snowfall, seemed like a waste of time to my impatient mind. But Nana handed me a thick blanket, a cup of warm tea, and guided me to the window that faced the northern meadow. "Look closely," she said. "Notice the shape of each flake, the way the light touches the snow, the silence that follows the storm. This is life's quiet lesson." I wrapped the blanket around me and pressed my nose to the cold glass, feeling the chill seep through, but also feeling a strange warmth in my heart. As the hours passed, I began to notice details I had never appreciated. Each snowflake was unique, intricate, and fleeting. The wind shifted patterns, and shadows danced over the frozen ground. The silence was profound, punctuated only by the occasional crack of a branch or distant animal tracks. I realized that beauty is often subtle, hidden in details we overlook, and that patience allows us to see it. Nana had been right. This was not something to rush or force. It revealed itself slowly, rewarding those willing to wait and observe. I also learned the importance of stillness. In a world full of noise, activity, and distraction, sitting quietly and simply watching felt revolutionary. I noticed how my mind, initially restless, gradually slowed, allowing me to experience the moment fully. I began to understand that patience is not passive. It is active awareness, a way to open oneself to the present and receive its gifts. That night, the falling snow became a teacher, and I was a willing student. Nana shared stories as we watched. She told me of winters in her youth, of skating on frozen ponds, building snowmen with her siblings, and listening to the wind whip through the valleys. She spoke of the resilience required to endure harsh weather, the joy found in simple pleasures, and the ways life's most profound lessons often come quietly. I listened, absorbing not only her words but the rhythm of the snowfall, the gentle hush of the night, and the lessons embedded in patience and observation. By midnight, the snow had thickened, covering the garden, rooftops, and fences in pristine white. I felt a sense of awe that I had never known before, a mixture of humility and gratitude. The world, for all its complexity and chaos, could be transformed into something serene and magical, simply by slowing down and observing. I realized that patience and attentiveness reveal layers of life that are otherwise hidden, and that wonder is cultivated through quiet focus and presence. The night also taught me the value of resilience. Snowfall, though delicate in appearance, transforms the landscape and persists until it is shifted by sun, wind, or human activity. Life, I understood, is like the snowfall. Moments of beauty and challenge arrive gradually, and their impact is felt over time. Observing the snow taught me to appreciate gradual change, to embrace the slow unfolding of events, and to recognize that patience yields understanding and appreciation. As dawn approached, the first light of morning touched the snow, making it sparkle like a field of diamonds. The village was hushed, the roads empty, and the world seemed reborn. I felt a sense of renewal in my chest, a quiet joy in having witnessed something fleeting yet eternal. Nana smiled and said, "Remember, Margaret, the best lessons often come in quiet moments, when the world slows down and you pay attention. Life is full of such moments, if only you are willing to notice." I understood that the night had taught me about mindfulness, gratitude, and the power of observation. Even now, decades later, I remember that night vividly. The lessons of patience, stillness, wonder, and resilience have stayed with me. I carry them into every part of my life, reminding myself to slow down, to observe carefully, and to seek beauty in small, fleeting moments. The snowfall taught me that life is richer when experienced fully, with presence, attention, and appreciation. That first night watching snowfall also taught me humility. I realized how small I was in the vastness of the universe, how fleeting a single moment could be, and yet how profoundly it could affect the heart. The beauty of life often arrives quietly, demanding only our willingness to watch, listen, and learn. I learned that patience allows us to witness magic, and that wonder nourishes the soul in ways that noise, haste, or distraction cannot. From that night on, I have sought quiet moments, times to pause, reflect, and appreciate the beauty around me. Whether it is snowfall, a blooming flower, or a serene sunset, I remember Nana's guidance and the lessons of that magical night. That patience cultivates awareness, that stillness reveals wonder, and that the smallest, quietest moments often carry the greatest lessons of life. I remember the first time I went fishing with Nana, a day that taught me lessons in patience, persistence, and a deep connection to nature. I was 15, and the small river that ran just beyond our village glimmered in the morning sun, its water sparkling like liquid glass. Nana carried our fishing rods, a wicker basket for any catch, and a calm determination that I would soon learn to appreciate. "Margaret," she said, "fishing is not just about catching fish. It teaches you patience, observation, and respect for the world around you. Today, you will learn more than a skill. You will learn how to listen and wait." At first, I was eager to catch something, convinced that success would come quickly. I tied the bait onto the hook, cast my line with trembling hands, and watched it sink into the water. Minutes passed with nothing, then hours, and my excitement slowly turned into frustration. I whispered to Nana, "Why isn't anything biting?" She smiled gently and replied, "Patience, Margaret. Fishing, like life, cannot be rushed. The river has its own rhythm, and you must learn to move with it." I soon realized that fishing demanded more than just throwing a line into the water. It required observation. Nana taught me to watch the movement of the fish, the ripples on the surface, the subtle shifts in the water that indicated life beneath. She explained how wind, temperature, and even the time of day affected behavior. I began to notice the birds overhead, the insects skimming the water, and the way the sunlight danced across the river's surface. Each detail mattered, and slowly I understood that fishing is as much about understanding the environment as it is about catching fish. Patience became my greatest lesson. Sitting quietly, line in the water, waiting for a bite, I discovered the value of stillness. My mind, initially restless, began to calm as I focused on the subtle signs of movement in the water. I realized that patience is active. It is not idle waiting, but attentive observation, readiness, and persistence. Nana's presence beside me reinforced this. She moved slowly, spoke softly, and encouraged me to embrace the rhythm of the river rather than fight against it. Persistence was another key lesson. Hours passed with no success, and I wanted to give up, convinced I was doing something wrong. But Nana reminded me, "Every cast is a chance, Margaret. Some days you will catch nothing, and some days you will catch plenty. Do not let discouragement stop you." I learned that persistence, even in the face of apparent failure, often leads to reward. Every effort, even when it seems fruitless, builds skill, understanding, and resilience. When I finally felt a tug on the line, my heart leapt. Nana's calm voice guided me through the steps: how to reel in steadily, how to keep the line taut, and how to respect the fish once caught. The struggle was exhilarating, and the satisfaction of success, after hours of waiting and observing, was profound. I realized that the reward is sweeter when earned through patience, care, and attentive effort. The fish itself became a symbol of what can be achieved through persistence and attentiveness, reminding me that effort and patience yield tangible results. Fishing also taught me humility. The river was vast, unpredictable, and alive with forces beyond my control. Sometimes the fish eluded me, sometimes the bait floated away, and sometimes the weather shifted suddenly. I realized that life, like the river, cannot be controlled entirely, and that respect for nature's rhythms is essential. Humility, I learned, is not weakness. It is the understanding that we are part of a larger system, and success often comes from cooperation, observation, and respect rather than force. Beyond skill, patience, and humility, fishing taught me connection to the environment, to Nana, and to myself. Sitting by the river, watching the water, feeling the sun and wind, and listening to Nana's gentle guidance, I felt a deep bond with the world around me. Nature teaches lessons in subtlety and persistence, and I understood that taking the time to connect with it enriches the soul. Nana's wisdom reminded me that slowing down and observing life's rhythms fosters insight, appreciation, and inner calm. Even decades later, when I see a river, a pond, or even the smallest stream, I remember that first day fishing with Nana. The lessons of patience, persistence, observation, humility, and connection remain vivid. I carry them into every part of my life, understanding that success is often gradual, that attention to detail matters, and that the process itself can be as meaningful as the outcome. The river taught me to trust, to wait, and to observe, and the experience shaped my character in ways that extend far beyond the skill of fishing. That first fishing trip with Nana also taught me gratitude. I learned to appreciate the bounty of nature, the effort behind every catch, and the quiet moments shared with someone who guided me patiently. The fish, the river, the gentle morning air, they all became part of a lesson in mindfulness, patience, and respect. I discovered that the gifts of life are often subtle, and that taking time to notice, learn, and engage makes each moment more meaningful. Fishing with Nana became a metaphor for life, to be patient, persistent, and attentive, to respect forces beyond our control, to engage fully with the world, and to celebrate even small victories. The lessons I learned that day continue to guide me in every challenge, reminding me that effort, care, and presence create lasting reward and connection. I remember the first time I learned to garden herbs with Nana, a moment that taught me lessons in sustainability, patience, and nurturing growth. I was 16, and our small backyard was filled with sunlight, soft soil, and the promise of green life. Nana carried a basket of young seedlings, basil, rosemary, thyme, and parsley, and handed me a small trowel. "Margaret," she said, "gardening teaches more than planting seeds. It teaches patience, care, and the understanding that life grows slowly, with attention and respect. Today, you will learn to nurture both plants and the habits that sustain them." At first, I felt unsure. The seedlings were delicate, their roots small and fragile, and the soil seemed foreign beneath my fingers. I worried that I might damage them, or that they might not grow at all. Nana knelt beside me, her hands steady as she demonstrated how to dig small holes, gently place each seedling in the earth, and cover the roots carefully. "Do not rush, Margaret," she said. "These plants are alive, and they respond to patience and care." I followed her instructions meticulously, discovering that gardening requires both gentleness and consistency. The first lesson was patience. Seeds and seedlings cannot be hurried. They grow according to their own rhythm. Nana explained that watering too much or too little, exposing plants to the wrong temperature, or disturbing their roots can slow growth or cause harm. I learned that patience is not passive. It is an active form of care, requiring observation, understanding, and attentiveness. Day by day, as I watered, weeded, and observed the small plants, I began to see subtle changes. Tiny shoots pushing through soil, leaves unfurling, and roots taking hold. Each new sign of growth was a reward for steady effort, a reminder that time and care produce results. Gardening also taught me responsibility. The plants depended on me for nourishment and protection. I learned to monitor the soil, check for pests, and ensure the seedlings had enough sunlight. Each decision mattered, and I began to understand that responsibility is not a burden, but an opportunity to create something meaningful. Caring for living things requires attentiveness, empathy, and diligence, qualities that extend far beyond the garden. Sustainability became another lesson. Nana explained that plants, like life, are part of a larger ecosystem. Composting, using water wisely, and rotating crops were not just practical tasks. They were ways to respect the earth and its resources. I realized that sustainable practices, though sometimes tedious or small, have long-term benefits. Gardening taught me to think beyond immediate results, to consider the future, and to understand that growth, whether of plants, relationships, or personal skills, requires careful stewardship. Creativity was also part of the process. Nana encouraged me to plan the layout of the herb garden, to consider which plants thrive together, and to imagine how the garden would look when fully grown. I learned to mix textures, colors, and fragrances, discovering that practical work can also be an act of artistic expression. Creativity, I realized, is enhanced by thoughtful observation and deliberate action, and it flourishes when combined with care and knowledge. The act of nurturing life brought lessons in humility. Not every plant survived. Some seedlings wilted despite my efforts. Some leaves were eaten by pests, and some failed to thrive. Nana reminded me gently, "Not everything can be controlled, Margaret. Learn from what fails, adjust, and continue. Growth is both delicate and resilient." I understood that failure is part of learning, that effort must be persistent yet flexible, and that resilience is built through practice and care. I also learned to observe closely. Gardening required attention to subtle signs, the color of leaves, the texture of the soil, the growth patterns of each plant. I realized that observation is not passive, it is active engagement, a skill that reveals hidden truths and informs decisions. Each time I noticed a new shoot or a healthy leaf, I felt satisfaction not only for the plant's growth, but for the understanding I had gained in tending it. By the end of the season, the herb garden flourished. Basil leaves glistened in the sunlight, thyme released its fragrant scent, and rosemary stood upright, resilient and strong. I felt pride in what I had nurtured, understanding that growth requires patience, persistence, and care. Nana smiled as we harvested herbs for cooking, tea, and medicine, and I realized that the lessons of the garden extended far beyond the soil. They were lessons about life, about dedication, mindfulness, nurturing, patience, and respect for both living things and the resources that sustain them. Even decades later, when I tend a garden, I remember that first experience with Nana. I recall the tactile sensation of soil in my hands, the delicate fragility of seedlings, and the quiet joy of watching them thrive under my care. Gardening taught me that patience produces beauty, that persistence nurtures life, and that mindful attention connects us deeply to the world around us. The herb garden became a metaphor for all growth, personal, relational, and spiritual, and it instilled values that continue to guide me today. That first lesson in gardening was more than planting herbs. It was a lesson in life. It reminded me that nurturing requires patience, that care creates resilience, and that the rewards of effort are both tangible and enduring. I learned that growth takes time, that the smallest actions matter, and that connection to nature strengthens both character and spirit. Nana's guidance in the garden became a foundation for my understanding of patience, responsibility, and the lasting joy that comes from helping life flourish. I remember the first time I wrote a letter to a distant relative, a simple act that taught me lessons in communication, empathy, and the importance of preserving connections. I was 16, and our home smelled faintly of ink and parchment. The desk bathed in the soft afternoon light that streamed through the window. Nana had handed me a sheet of paper, an envelope, and a fountain pen that I had only used for practice. "Margaret," she said, "letters are more than words on paper. They carry your thoughts, your heart, and your respect for someone else. Today, you will learn how to connect across distance and how communication shapes relationships." At first, I felt uncertain. Writing a letter seemed formal, almost intimidating. I wasn't sure how to express my thoughts, how to make them meaningful, or how to convey warmth through pen and paper. Nana guided me gently, reminding me that sincerity is more important than style. "Write as you would speak to them in person, Margaret," she said. "Let your words carry kindness, honesty, and attention. That is what makes a letter alive." I nodded and began to think carefully about what I wanted to say, realizing that writing requires mindfulness, reflection, and the ability to see through someone else's eyes. I started with greetings, then shared updates about our family, the small happenings in the village, and the lessons I had learned that year. Nana reminded me to include thoughts that would engage the reader, to ask questions about their life, and to show genuine interest in their well-being. I realized that communication is reciprocal. It requires both expression and listening, even across distance. A letter, she explained, is a bridge that carries empathy, care, and connection from one heart to another. As I wrote, I noticed how much thought each sentence demanded. I had to consider clarity, tone, and meaning. Words that seemed simple aloud required careful choice on paper. I learned that communication is not just about conveying information. It is about creating understanding, showing respect, and fostering relationships. Writing the letter became an exercise in empathy. Imagining how my relative would read each word, how they would feel, and what joy or comfort my message might bring. Nana taught me the importance of honesty in letters. I could write about joy, sadness, achievements, or challenges, as long as I spoke truthfully and thoughtfully. She said, "People value authenticity, Margaret. A letter that comes from the heart carries far more than words that merely sound pleasant." I realized that communication, whether written or spoken, has power. It can build trust, strengthen relationships, and leave a lasting impression when it is sincere, thoughtful, and attentive. Addressing the envelope became a lesson in responsibility and care. Writing the correct name, the address, and sealing the envelope properly were small but significant acts. Nana reminded me, "Details matter, Margaret. Showing care in these small things reflects respect for the person who will receive your letter." I understood that attention to detail, whether in letters or in life, communicates thoughtfulness and consideration, and that small gestures often carry profound meaning. As I placed the letter in the mailbox, I felt a quiet sense of connection, as though a piece of my world had traveled across distance to reach someone else. Nana smiled and said, "See, Margaret? Even when people are far away, thoughtful communication keeps bonds alive. Relationships thrive on attention, care, and the willingness to reach out." I realized that maintaining connections requires effort, mindfulness, and intention, and that even a single letter can nurture love, respect, and understanding across miles and years. I also learned that patience is part of communication. After sending the letter, I would have to wait for a reply, sometimes for weeks. Nana explained that the wait is not idle. It is part of the rhythm of connection. Anticipation allows reflection, deepens appreciation, and teaches the value of thoughtful responses. I realized that meaningful communication cannot be rushed. It grows richer when given time to be received, understood, and reciprocated. When the reply finally arrived, I felt a surge of joy. The letter contained updates, questions, and warmth that mirrored my own intentions. I read each word carefully, savoring the connection and understanding that this exchange was more than a conversation. It was a bond sustained across distance and time. I recognized that communication is a living thing, nurtured through attention, empathy, and care, and that it strengthens both those who give and those who receive. Even decades later, I still write letters occasionally, and I treasure the ones I receive. The lessons I learned from that first letter with Nana about empathy, patience, attention to detail, honesty, and connection remain with me. I understand that communication is a bridge, that thoughtful words can travel far, and that maintaining bonds requires effort, presence, and care. Writing that first letter taught me that distance cannot diminish love, understanding, or respect. It can only deepen the value of thoughtful expression. That experience with Nana shaped my approach to relationships throughout life. I learned to speak with care, to listen with intention, and to sustain connections even when miles or years separate us. Writing a letter became a lesson in mindfulness, empathy, and devotion, teaching me that communication, when nurtured with sincerity, preserves bonds, honors others, and leaves a lasting legacy of connection and love.